This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
when you ponder the truths you've heard, may they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to this clean-cut episode of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is August 25th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. What you're about to hear is part 3 of an examination of Mark Hofmann, one of the greatest forgers known to history. If you want to know about everything up to this point, I may recommend going back and listening to part 1 and 2. But if you don't mind picking up in the middle of the story, or you're all caught up, then this would be the episode for you. Why is it important to learn about Mark Hofmann? I've been asking myself this for a few weeks now, and I'm not sure that I have a definitive answer yet. Yes, I find him to be extremely fascinating, and I need no further excuse to research something than just simple fascination. But there's more to Hofmann than I could understand if I were to study him for decades. I suppose any story like this that sits in living color in front of us is just as fascinating, but there are certain elements to the Hofmann story that keep my mind racing at night while I just stare at the blank ceiling above. Why? Why is a powerful word, isn't it? I mean, I just went on vacation. Why? Because I needed to leave the city for a weekend. I just went for a bike ride. Why? To get some exercise, enjoy the outdoors. I just killed 2 people and almost myself with sophisticated pipe bombs. Why? Why? On the evening of October 16th, 1985, Hofmann was in the intensive care unit of LDS General Hospital, recovering from his own bomb that had flayed the roof of his car open and severely damaged his leg and hands, left gashes on his forehead and all over his body. After questioning Hofmann, the police found probable cause to search his home, where they found his document forge and a green Letterman jacket that a witness had seen Hofmann wearing before dropping off the bomb that had killed Stephen Christensen in the Judge Building. The police had reason to believe that Hofmann was a lone bomber without any accomplices. I'll tell you right now, there's no evidence to suggest otherwise, and I don't tend to align with conspiracy theories that may claim otherwise. The idea that Hofmann may have been forging documents to sell or trade was not necessarily a new concept at the end of 1985 when the bombs went off. Christensen, Metcalf, Ashworth, the Tanners, plenty of people close to Hofmann, or even just in Mormon circles in general, were beginning to question the legitimacy of some of Hoffmann's more miraculous finds. The problem was, as it had always been, nobody knew the extent to which Hofmann had influenced the world of Mormon history. As soon as public discourse began to question if Hofmann was a forger or not, it put a hold on any deals that involved Mormon documents. Overnight, any deals that Hofmann was in the middle of evaporated. He was still on the hook for nearly $3 million of today's money to pay out to multiple entities, but after the bombs went off, Hofmann was out of a job and the primary suspect of 2 murders. As a result, people were quickly turning hostile against him. The Bureau of the ATF were involved with the local police department to find all of the links to Hofmann and the bombs possible. Because it involved millions of dollars in forgeries, the FBI also stepped in, bringing never-before-seen attention to nice little Salt Lake City. The news cycle exploded with articles like we read in the last episode. People everywhere were hearing the story of bombs going off in Salt Lake City. Some were saying it was organized crime from investors that had lost $5 million in the CFS investments. I mean, others heard that the bombs were somehow related to Mormon history. But what about Mormon history would cause somebody to kill two people with bombs? Only a small number of people on the inside of this story were aware of what was going on with the documents Hofmann was selling. And out of those people, a very small number actually thought that Hofmann was a forger and bomb maker. It's hard to convey just how confusing and perplexing the situation was when the story broke out into the mainstream and everybody was talking about it, which made the confusion even worse. The hushed whispers that were spoken among a few document collectors that Hofmann might not be all that trustworthy rose to audible murmurings running rampant throughout the Mormon historical community once these articles circulating. I mean, articles coming from the Deseret News during this time are amazing. Oftentimes, it doesn't seem like we put enough stock into local reporting. Historically, local reporting is shown to be one of the more reliable sources because it captures what it was like to be there when the story broke. During the next few days of the Deseret News, a murder mystery unfolds in living color. It's great to watch a movie unfold a mystery plot over an hour and a half, but this was real life with real newspaper articles, spanning multiple days. Real people had died, and real people might still be in danger. Here are some headlines and summaries of the next few days in the church-owned Deseret News. Headline: Police focus on evidence, not theories. Theories of conspiracies, elaborate forgeries, and $100,000 payoffs may make interesting reading, but police say they are more interested in solving two murders. Investigators are downplaying media reports that documents found in Hofmann's car and home may have been forgeries. In fact, most investigators refuse to even comment on reports forged documents may be the motive behind the Tuesday killings of Stephen Christensen and Kathy Sheets. Next headline: Killings entail classic motives. Money, revenge, secrets may be part of Salt Lake murder mystery. This one contemplates some possible motives, so that's kind of exciting. A murder mystery, possibly with all the classic motives, forgery, large sums of money, revenge, and secret documents, is unraveling now in the bomb killings of two Salt Lakers earlier this week, and the severe injury of another. The next headline: No fiction writer could come up with stranger scenarios or plots. The ultimate motive for the killings will not surface until a prosecutor faces a jury and lays out a plausible scenario. Here are some of the possibilities. This is exciting too. 1. Murder to cover up forgeries or possible forgeries. Material in Hofmann's car led police to believe that he had been practicing forging documents. Number 2, murder to avenge a broken business deal or eliminate a middleman who would want a cut of the action. Number 3, murder to eliminate Christensen, then bomb plantings or attempted plantings to divert attention from any connection to Mormon documents and towards CFS Financial Corp., the troubled investment firm in which Sheets and Christensen were officers. That same article continues on here. To be honest, said Brent Metcalf, whom Christensen hired to research the Harris letter, the only thing the White Salamander letter has to do with the case is that it introduced Mark Hofmann to Steve Christensen. Metcalf, whom Christensen paid to research the Harris letter, knew Christensen, Hofmann, and Sheets well. Devastated by Christensen's death, he said he vacillated between the two motives, CFS business dealings or historical document trafficking, but worried about himself and his friend's safety because of their connections to Christensen and Sheets. Wednesday, he stopped by Signature Books to see friends, and someone told him a car had been bombed at the LDS Church office building. It didn't make sense because none of us can park there, Metcalf said. Metcalf then called a reporter at the Salt Lake Tribune, who told him the car was parked near the Deseret Gym and checked the report as to the color and make. I said, "That's the same as Mark's. I've got to get over there." Metcalf said he drove there and saw the car, but his friend had been taken away. I grabbed a policeman and told him who I was. He called a detective, who told me my life might be in danger and took me into protective custody. I was just shaking. just falling apart. That's the end of quoting Brent Metcalf. This is from another article. Hofmann also traded important documents of American history. It talks about the oath of a freeman for like 12 paragraphs, then quotes an anonymous source in saying, quote, "Another source said, in addition to the oath of a freeman, Hofmann has collected letters from some important early American figures that he planned to sell, including documents written by Edgar Allan Poe and Abraham Lincoln. Hofmann dealt heavily in early American documents and books. The Mormon stuff is probably only 20% of his business activities," the source said, end quote. Those are some of the headlines that were circulating in the following days after the bombings. Now, just speaking specifically about that last one, whether we can trust that 20% number or not doesn't seem to matter for our purposes. The point is, rumors were circulating everywhere about just how far and wide Hofmann's forgeries had infected history. People holding documents they had bought from Hofmann or one of his affiliates were suddenly faced with the possibility that they were holding something that was essentially worthless, something they had paid who knows how much money for. That being said, the church was still under the impression that the Salamander letter was real, even knowing that it came from Hofmann. Now, whether or not Hofmann was dealing in forgeries, the church had invested a lot of time and even more money into verifying the legitimacy of the Salamander letter, and they weren't so excited to walk back and say that it was all a fake document and admit that they had been swindled. What's more is they had invested apologetics resources into justifying the letter with their own narrative. That's where the big investment came in that they didn't want to embrace as a useless investment. They'd spoken in general conferences about the Salamander letter. They had released dozens of articles in the Deseret News about it. Dean Jesse had written his treatise on the legitimacy of the letter. The church was locked into a sunk cost relationship with this cancerous Salamander letter, and it was eating countless church resources and still causing members to leave. The church still wasn't sure what to do with the Salamander letter. Now, on the 20th of October, another person was arrested under suspicion of being Hofmann's accomplice. A man named Shannon Patrick Flynn was suspected of association with Hofmann in his criminal dealings. Also, the Uzi that he and Hofmann owned was found in Flynn's possession. Now, Hofmann and Flynn had converted this Uzi to be fully automatic, which is illegal and brings a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. Flynn was arrested while Hofmann was, not really going anywhere, recovering at the LDS hospital, and oddly enough, Flynn made the $50,000 bail 2 days later. When the police searched his home, they found a copy of the Anarchist's Cookbook, which has many step-by-step recipes to making bombs. Now, whether Hofmann needed the cookbook to make the pipe bombs or not is unknown, but mere possession of that book along with the Uzi was enough for police to connect the dots, which landed Flynn in jail. He would later be acquitted of any prosecution because links between him and Hofmann were circumstantial business deals at best. There was actually no connection between the two friends. Over the next few weeks, people everywhere volunteered cooperation with the FBI, the ATF, and local police officials to try and piece this Hofmann case together. We're going to continue on in Hofmann's timeline here. On October 19th, 1985, the church announced that the Harris letter, that's the Salamander letter, was given to the FBI to authenticate. The FBI did tests that didn't indicate it was a forgery, and then a second search of Hofmann's home was conducted after that. On October 21st, Elder Hugh Pinnock releases details of his role in obtaining a loan for Hofmann. He had given Hofmann $185,000 to go purchase the McClellan collection. Then on October 23rd, in a news conference, Elders Gordon B. Hinckley and Dallin Oaks and Hugh Pinnock gave details about their contacts with Hofmann. And then on October 25th, Elder Pinnock repays Hofmann's loan to the First Interstate Bank. He just decided, I'm going to cut my losses, I'm not going to see that money again, and he repaid the loan instead of Hofmann. And then on October 30th, information from Kenneth Rendell says that the papyrus that Hofmann tried to peddle was actually from him, and it wasn't part of any of the McClellan collection. So pieces were starting to come together as far as how far and wide Hofmann's document forgery were playing into multiple business deals. I mean, people were coming out of the woodwork everywhere to try and absolve themselves of any guilt in connection with Hofmann and the bombs, of course. When the FBI began investigating the Insular Society of Deep Mormon History, they found names and institutions that kept coming up. Lynn Jacobs, Brent Metcalf, Brent Ashworth, Gordon B. Hinckley, J. Schiller Company in New York. The government officials gathered as much evidence as they possibly could from every source they possibly could. Now, we have the benefit of seeing these things play out in hindsight. We can look back at this 30 years after it happened with the eye of an overseer and understand what was happening. Now, granted, there is a bit of historical fog as to what it must have felt like to be one of these people with articles circulating about you being connected to Hofmann through business deals, and we can't understand what that must have felt like. But we know what happened, and we have the benefit of near historical omniscience at this point when it comes to the Hofmann timeline. For the people that were experiencing this in real time, though, it was a very different reality for them. They had the fog of unknown future events to cloud their judgment and actions. For all they knew, another bomb could go off any day and kill somebody else that was associated with Mormon history. People were on the edge of their seats for weeks while these events played out and newspapers circulated articles talking about Hofmann. Then finally, on October 31st, Hofmann was released from the LDS General Hospital, and later in the day he was charged with illegal possession of a machine gun, that was the Uzi, and he pled innocent to this, and he posted the $50,000 bail to get out of jail. After that, a Daniel Boone letter, which was supposedly written April 1st, 1775, was sold at Sotheby's auction for $31,900. The letter was a Hofmann creation, and Sotheby's later bought the letter back when they found out. So then going into November of 1985, a grand jury hears from people who dealt with Hofmann, and no charges were filed. They were still wondering what was going on, who was responsible for all of this, and is he actually a legitimate document forger? The evidence wasn't sticking to him quite yet. And the same thing the police had charged Shannon Patrick Flynn with, the possession of the Uzi, they arrested Hofmann for, but, he posted the bail, just as Flynn had done a week before. But Hofmann was also a flight risk, and there was also this pending investigation of him as the primary suspect in 2 murders, right? I mean, the police took his password and placed him on travel restriction for fear he would flee the country. They also placed surveillance squad on Hofmann to track his movement. So, when you're a prime suspect in the heinous deaths of 2 people, you tend to lose a lot of freedoms, and Hofmann was feeling the wrath of that effect. Then, something remarkable happened. Now, there are small communities online and probably in some books somewhere that posit conspiracy theories that will claim Hofmann was just a fall guy for a larger conspiracy. He might have been involved in some way, but he wasn't the guy that set the bombs. And thus, he was a victim of a bombing. He didn't manufacture the bombs. Of course, the evidence doesn't lend credibility to that. But what happened next is one piece of evidence that these people will often claim as supporting evidence for these wider conspiracy theories. Now, I said last episode, I don't buy any of these. I don't espouse any of these conspiracy theories. I think that the historical record surrounding Hofmann, as we widely understand it, is probably the most reliable. But I do take a bit of pause at what happened next, because on November 13th of 85, Hofmann took a polygraph test. Now, you may be saying, well, there you go. He took the polygraph test. There's our silver bullet. You can nail him down on the polygraph and admit the results as evidence in court, and bam, you got your conviction. Everybody goes home, bad guy goes to jail for eternity, and we all sleep better at night knowing that a lunatic is off the streets. Unfortunately, things aren't quite so cut and dried. Polygraph tests aren't 100% accurate. In fact, many critics claim that they are less accurate than chance and have different levels of effectiveness for different personality types. They can also be more effective when asking details of a crime as opposed to asking straightforward questions if the person committed the crime like you would expect. For example, If a person is being polygraph tested for petty theft, the examiner will often avoid the question of, did you steal the money, until the end of the examination. The more pertinent question is, was the stolen money in the amount of $100, $500, or $2,000, which causes more stimulation on the polygraph when the person knows the specific dollar amount of the crime. This is also why polygraph results are only occasionally admitted as evidence in a court. Now, to dive in this even deeper, an argument can be made that polygraphs are nothing more than antiquated relics of 1920s pseudoscience that don't actually hold any relevance to real detective work. It's the person conducting the polygraph that determines if a person is lying or not necessarily the machine itself. The psychological effects of the polygraph machine combined with the stoic and intimidating person that's conducting the 90-minute question and answer session is what determines whether or not a person is lying. It's not so much the machine, but the polygraphist that can tell when a person is lying. But it also needs to be said, people are capable of fooling polygraphs. The polygraph measures physiological changes during a person's answer to any given question. When a person lies, their stress level increases, which the polygraph measures by checking their breath, their heart rate, and the conductivity of their skin to measure sweat levels. Hofmann was a habitual liar. We know that from the many business deals he orchestrated with nothing but his own lies backing him up. Somebody like Hofmann, who lies constantly, is capable of suppressing those physiological tells that most honest people exhibit while they are lying. That makes sense, right? Somebody who lies all the time is practiced at doing so and can fool the polygraph into thinking that they aren't lying. Famously, the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, and Charles Cullen, another serial killer, and plenty of other high-level criminals fooled multiple polygraph tests that were designed to catch these people lying. The polygraph is ill-equipped to identify hardened liars like these men. Hofmann, just like others before and after him, fooled the polygraph test. He didn't show signs of lying when asked critical questions about the bombings. Now, a normal modern polygraph test will issue a degree of certainty in its findings. It will say that the test subject was lying during a given question with a % degree of confidence. If somebody exhibits signs of lying when asked a question, the polygraph will say that it measured spikes in the ratings indicative of lying during the question with like an 85% level of confidence or something. Not only was Hofmann able to confuse the polygraphs into less than a 50% level of confidence, but when he was asked the questions of, did you kill the people in the bombings of October 15th, and were you in the judge building the morning in a green jacket dropping off a package, Hofmann was able to fool those polygraphs into a false degree of negative response. The polygraph said that Hofmann specifically wasn't lying when he blatantly said he had nothing to do with the bombings. On November 13th, Hofmann took and passed this polygraph, and by November 20th, his attorney had issued statements that he had passed the polygraph, which came into conflict with the case that the police were building. Also, the police didn't find any actual bomb-making equipment in Hofmann's home. I believe I said that they did at the end of last episode, but I was only going off of news articles that were reporting such information. The only bomb-making materials the police found in Hofmann's possession were some surgical gloves and metal pipe in the trunk of his blown-up car. See, the case isn't quite as open and shut as we would expect it to be, especially when you throw in the mixed results of the polygraph test coming back negative. Now, what I'm about to read is from a Deseret News, November 20th, 1985. Now, it's a long article, but there's a ton of relevant information in it, and so I'm going to read the majority of it. There's a link for it in the show notes. It's an actual photocopy of the paper. It's on Google News Archives, and do yourself a service of going through and actually reading this November 20th article, because there's just a ton of information that I'm going to be leaving out that's just remarkable in it. The article is titled, Salt Lake Police Believe Canyon Home May Be Site of Bomb Construction, by Jerry Spangler and Brett Del Porto, Deseret News staff writers. Salt Lake police confirm that they have searched a vacant Emigration Canyon home that Mark W. Hofmann was trying to buy, and they believe the house may be the site where the bombs killed 2 people October 15th were constructed. A weekend search of the home produced significant evidence in the case. Police say a disclosure that came in the wake of claims by defense attorney that Hofmann passed a polygraph examination that indicates he has no involvement in the October 15th bombings. Sources told the Deseret News that search warrants were executed on an Immigration Canyon home that Hofmann had been negotiating to buy. The searches were conducted Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of last week. Investigators refused to elaborate on what evidence they recovered, but one investigator said, "We found what we've been looking for all along." The Deseret News has confirmed that the items recovered from the residence have been sent for analysis to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., and the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Laboratory in San Francisco. The role of the ATF laboratory thus far in the murder investigation has been to examine evidence related to the actual bombs. Police sources said a caretaker at the Immigration Canyon home left the residence on October 11th and returned October 15th. The day bombs killed Stephen Christensen and Kathy Webb Sheets. Upon his return, the caretaker noted that someone had broken into a work shed and that a drill had been left on the counter and a light left on, police said. Police have said for some time that if Hofmann made the bombs, he did not make them in his own home in the presence of his wife and children. Police reportedly found no evidence in Hofmann's home of bomb manufacturing. Since then, police have been searching storage sheds and associates' apartments for evidence of where the bombs were manufactured. Prior attempts to find where the bombs were made were reportedly futile. Hofmann was named as a prime suspect shortly after he was injured by a third bomb blast October 16th. Investigators, however, have come under increasing criticism from defense attorneys and associates of Hofmann who claim police have no evidence against him. Probers dispute those claims, noting there are 2 eyewitnesses who saw Hofmann carry a package wrapped in brown butcher paper and addressed to Christensen into the judge building where Christensen worked. They also note that brown paper, a marking pen, metal pipe, and rubber surgical gloves were recovered from the trunk of Hofmann's car. Investigators said lab tests conducted by ATF, as well as evidence recovered during searches of Hofmann's car and home, have provided critical evidence that may link the bombings to Hofmann. The latest evidence would seem to contradict the results of lie detector tests arranged by Hofmann's attorney. Hofmann's associate Shannon Patrick Flynn also passed a polygraph examination several weeks ago concerning possible involvement in the bombings. Police have maintained publicly that Flynn is not a suspect in the bombings. Flynn and Hofmann have both been charged with possession of an unregistered automatic weapon, the Uzi, a charge police say is unrelated to the bombings. Flynn's attorneys have tried unsuccessfully to use the results of Flynn's polygraph examination to negotiate a plea bargain on the weapons charge. The Salt Lake County Attorney's Office has reportedly refused the attorney's offers. Investigators told the Deseret News that witnesses have placed Flynn, Hofmann, and Brent L. Metcalf, another business associate, together on the night before the bombings. Hofmann attorney Ron Yangich and Charles Robert Hauntz, a nationally recognized expert in polygraph examinations, conducted the test on Hofmann and determined Hofmann was telling the truth when he said he was not involved in the bombings that killed Christensen and Sheets. He also determined Hofmann was an unknowing victim of the third bomb that exploded in his car. Copies of the lie detector results have been given to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Salt Lake County Attorney's Office. Defense attorney Bradley Rich said he hopes the polygraph examinations will have 2 effects. We're hoping to convince the police that they ought to be looking for someone else and that Hofmann is not the person who committed the crime. We're hoping to undo the negative publicity that has been forthcoming in the press from the police. We're hoping to neutralize all the accusations and having him declared a prime suspect. Rich said the ultimate purpose of the polygraph is not to convince the public that Hofmann was innocent. We just want them to keep an open mind. We think the polygraph goes some distance to showing he didn't do it. Polygraph examinations are admitted in court on occasion, but that's not the main reason Hofmann took the tests. We really hope the effects of this polygraph will be to make police look elsewhere, Rich said. Rich said that assuming Hofmann is innocent, the real bomber is still at large. I am concerned he's out there, and no telling who he might have in mind. Haunt's letter to defense attorneys said Hofmann told the truth during the November 13th polygraph examination when he answered no to the questions. Before it exploded, did you know there was a bomb in your car? Did you plant either of the bombs that exploded on October 15th? And did you yourself cause any of the bombings October 15th and 16th? Yangich said 2 independent experts reviewed the polygraph examination chart, including a law enforcement polygraph operator, and verified the results. One official, who asked not to be identified, said none of the investigators involved in the probe is concerned that the polygraph results might indicate police do not have the right suspect. Regardless of the results, Hofmann associates have reportedly been subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury that is apparently hearing evidence on the construction of explosive devices. Officials refuse to confirm or deny that a grand jury will hear evidence in the case. If you're a conspiracy theorist, I can just hear your brain exploding. The police were building up this case surrounded around Mark Hofmann, and him being the bomber. And a polygraph test was taken, and Hofmann passed it with flying colors, showing that he wasn't the person that was responsible. Now, like I've said, polygraph tests can be fooled. It only takes a seasoned liar to fool a polygraph, and Hofmann was definitely one of those. But here it seems, judging off of this one newspaper article, it seems like the prosecutors weren't so interested in hearing evidence that Hofmann wasn't responsible. They were much more interested in building this high-profile case at any expense, by any means necessary. Like I said, I think that the historical record is fairly trustworthy, but a conspiracy theorist-minded person might say, there's something worth looking into here. This is kind of weird. And the article goes on to say something even more interesting that, just keep on this conspiracy theorist cap for a minute. If you do buy into these conspiracy theories that Hofmann was set up, there's the next paragraph in this article does shed some light or lend credibility to those claims. Following a conference Tuesday morning, the justices have scheduled a hearing Friday morning to determine if the public and news media will be allowed to attend a second hearing Monday concerning critical evidence in the case. So, right there, we have suppression of information. The public was coming up with all sorts of theories about who was responsible for these bombings. And, Hofmann was the person that was being thrown around so much. Being the third person bombed, the police found evidence of, possible bomb-making materials in the trunk of his car. People were talking about Hofmann. But there were small subsects of people that were saying, well, maybe Hofmann wasn't it. Maybe somebody else is responsible, and Hofmann was just their third target, and it wasn't successful. But you think, man, the police ignored the polygraph test results. They held a conference whether or not they should have the news and the press in the trial proceedings. Man, it does look a little bit shifty when you think about it that way. But just because things were confusing, it doesn't mean that there's conspiracy going on. It doesn't mean that something was being suppressed or that knowledge or somebody's testimony was being suppressed here. Things were confusing, to say the least. And like I said earlier, we have the benefit of knowing what happens, right? We can view this through the lens where the conclusion is already understood and Hofmann's already in jail serving life plus 20. But back when this article was written, everything was up in the air. The possibility that Hofmann wasn't guilty and that the bomber was still at large began to scare some people that had become comforted by the mounting evidence that Hofmann was the bomber. Now this evidence comes out that he had passed the polygraph test and that officials couldn't necessarily put Hofmann in a location where he could have manufactured the bombs, and they couldn't find any bomb-making materials in his basement, just a pipe in the back of his car. People once again started to get a little bit uneasy. Now, there's one more piece of this article that I want to read, and it's something that I'm not sure how to interpret this here. It says, the justices will hear an appeal of an order issued several days ago by 3rd District Judge Dean E. Conder, who ruled that police officers can serve an investigative subpoena on a nurse who allegedly overheard a conversation between Mark Hofmann and Yangich, his attorney, when Hofmann was in the LDS hospital recovering from injuries suffered when a bomb exploded in October 16th in his car. So what happened is, there was a nurse that listened to the conversation, that overheard some sort of conversation, and then this district judge, Dean E. Condor, ruled that police officers can serve a subpoena to this nurse just to hear her testimony. Now that introduced something that's very challenging to wrap my mind around. It's said that they'll hear an appeal of a court order to subpoena this nurse to inquire concerning a conversation that she overheard with Hofmann and his attorney. This is walking some very fine ethical lines. Now, there are attorney-client privileges that protect information that's exchanged between attorneys and clients. There are also doctor-patient confidentiality clauses that protect any information that's exchanged between doctors and patients. But there's nothing saying that information a nurse overheard in a conversation is subject to any of these protections. This nurse may have overheard Hofmann talking to his attorney about how to play the legal game until a plea bargain is proposed or something like that. She may have even heard some details about how Hofmann manufactured the bombs. We don't really know. Or she may have heard something about Hofmann being framed and the real bomber still being out there. And unfortunately, we'll never know what she overheard because her testimony wasn't admitted to the court as evidence. Now, the justices walked a very fine line in deciding to not admit her testimony. Now, do you admit her testimony as evidence and then open Pandora's box to any nurse being subpoenaed into court about a conversation they may have overheard in passing? Or do you try and ignore this nurse's testimony and build a case based on hard evidence alone? Now, what if Hofmann really wasn't guilty and she overheard the name of the real bomber that was still at large? Her lack of testimony in the court may get an innocent man convicted and let a guilty murderer roam the streets. But if she were subpoenaed to court and gave her testimony, it could be wholly disregarded as hearsay from then on. And, all nurses after that would need to worry about what they had heard their patients talking about. And, maybe a bunch of nurses will start to get subpoenaed into court. Once again, you walk some fine ethical lines here. In my opinion, the Utah Supreme Court made the right decision in not admitting her testimony as evidence during the trial. We don't know what she said. I wish we could know that, but there was enough hard evidence surrounding Hofmann that didn't rely on overhearing something in conversation that convicted Hofmann. And I think they made a good move, ethically speaking, in not admitting the nurse's testimony as evidence. Now, while the FBI, the ATF, and the local police were investigating the bombings and they were amassing evidence for a conviction, the investigation into Hofmann's documents as forgeries really began to ramp up. There was an overwhelming preponderance of evidence in Hofmann's home that he was forging old documents, and now they needed to find out just how deep the tendrils of his fraud had extended. So December 17th to December 20th of 1985 is the first examination by George Throckmorton and William Flynn of their historic documents, of their LDS Historical Document Department. They walked into the church's department and they said, "We need to start looking through some of your documents." And this is when they discovered the cracked ink on documents that Hofmann had handled, but they weren't sure what had caused it. So then by the next month, from January 7th to the 20th, was a second examination of LDS Historical Department by George Throckmorton and William Flynn. About this time, the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. reports that its test had determined that the Harris 1830 letter, that's a salamander letter, was not a forgery. Neither was the 1829 printing contract for the Book of Mormon. Now, both of those were forgeries, but the FBI lab in Washington, D.C., they were examining this as a forensic document. They were actually seeing if this was a forgery, and the FBI's crime lab in D.C. said, these are legitimate documents. I mean, that just goes to show that Hofmann was the next level of forger, right? He was able to fool everybody with his stuff. But earlier in the previous month, Throckmorton and Flynn had seen this cracking in the ink, which is really fascinating if you see it, actually, because I saw a picture of a highly magnified period where Hofmann had put a period on this piece of paper, and it looks like almost like a desert scape. You know, the typical picture that you see of the desert where the whole valley floor of the desert is just this cracked chunk mud everywhere. That's what the period looks like. That's what the ink looked like at a certain magnification. So on January 22nd, there was a third examination by Throckmorton and Flynn, and that they were joined by a man named Al Leiter, who was another forensic document examiner. This exam took place in the Utah State Crime Lab. So they were grabbing documents from everywhere. They were taking them to multiple people, showing them to multiple forensics document examiners, and saying, hey, these might be forgeries. We need to really dig in deep and find what makes them forgeries. And that's, of course, like I said, when the cracked ink came out. And I'll talk about those in just a second, but I have to add a very small detail that's I think it kind of humanizes a lot of what we're talking about. Because on January 9th of 1986, Terry Christensen, who was Stephen Christensen's wife, delivered Stephen Fred Christensen Jr. And it's horrible to think that the bombing of Stephen Christensen left a widow that was pregnant with, Stephen Fred Christensen, his son, that was by the same name. She delivered him by cesarean section on Stephen's birthday. That would have been Stephen's 32nd birthday, January 9th. And, that's kind of horrible, right? If you think about this, an entire family's life was devastated by this bomb that went off, by the bomb that killed Stephen Christensen. An unborn child is going to grow up fatherless, with the same name as his father, with the same birthday as his father, because a bomb went off to cover up a crime. That's, kind of a small detail to add, but really horrible. I think it kind of humanizes the situation here. So going back to talking about the examinations by Throckmorton and Flynn here, ignoring that horrible detail, I'm going to read an extract real quick from utlm.org. A link is going to be in the show notes for this, but it basically goes through a series of quotes from George Throckmorton and William Flynn from various sources quoting what they found wrong with Hofmann's work as they studied his documents with increasing amounts of scrutiny. This is quoting from multiple sources, all found on this one utlm.org article. Quote, document examiners, of course, did find the common denominator between the salamander letter and other forgeries in the ink. William Flynn testified, the Martin Harris W.W. Phelps letter, that's a salamander letter, also is one of the documents that has the extensive surface cracking of the ink that I've talked about several times now. That was Deseret News article, May 12, 1986. A Utah documents expert has given additional testimony that the controversial Martin Harris letter, better known as the White Salamander letter, is a forgery. The Martin Harris letter Hofmann claimed to have discovered was different in two respects, Throckmorton said Monday. First, after it was folded, it was still possible to look inside and read the letter. And second, the sealing wax was in the extreme right-hand corner, not the center of the document. The suspicious cut marks on the Harris letter also were discovered on several other documents Hofmann claimed to have discovered. Throckmorton said the suspicious cut marks were discovered only on documents Hofmann said he discovered, and not on any of the other documents he examined. Throckmorton also testified about the unusual cracking effect exhibited in the ink on Hofmann's documents. He said he personally examined 688 documents, and that 21 showed microscopic ink cracking. Mark Hofmann was the source of all 21 documents. Throckmorton added he had never seen the ink cracking phenomenon before, and was unaware of similar ink cracking on any legitimate historical documents. After examining hundreds of documents, the expert said, the phenomenon was apparent only in those documents Hofmann claimed to have discovered. William Flynn testified that he did not believe that the writing on the document is authentic writing from that time. Mr. Flynn also said, "The paper itself appears to be genuine period paper. The writing itself does not appear to be genuine writing of that time period." Flynn also noted that one edge of the document had been cut. He said the cut probably was done with scissors, an irregular cut. Kenneth Rendell said that when he originally examined the salamander letter, he noticed it was not folded in the way normal cover letters were folded, but he felt that this in itself would not cause him to reject the letter's authenticity. He did state, however, that there's no logical reason that this letter is folded in that way. Throckmorton and Flynn seemed to feel that the peculiar way that the letter is folded and the evidence of cutting on the side may indicate that the paper used for the salamander letter came from a larger sheet of old paper, end quote. Or I would argue, out of the blank pages in old books that Mark Hofmann was buying up. But that's, neither here nor there. So once these document examiners found the tell, that's the cracking ink, Hofmann's forgeries could be seen from a mile away. Now, it was a matter of looking at the ink at a very specific magnification on a microscope that showed this cracking. That was a single point where Hofmann forgeries could be picked out of a group of documents and be identified without a shadow of a doubt. However, we run into some problems here. We know that any document Hofmann handled that was purchased or traded during a certain window of time with a certain ink on certain paper has a certain cracking at a certain magnification, and that's a definite forgery. But that sentence alone excludes a lot of possibilities. When the police went through Hofmann's basement, they found multiple vials of different inks, scraps of old paper from multiple sources, and even found some pages of a Book of Mormon that Hofmann was working on, possibly the 116 pages supposedly written by Martin Harris. There's also no telling how much inventory Hofmann moved. We don't know how many documents he bought or sold. We aren't even sure of what year he began forging these things. We don't know all of the inks that he used or where he found all of the source paper. Given the fact that we can positively identify these documents that are found in this small window that I described, certain time periods, certain paper, certain ink, certain so on and so forth, it leaves a lot of time and materials Hofmann could have manufactured that have yet to come to light. Hofmann may have been manufacturing plenty of old documents that don't have the cracked ink, thus making them harder to detect than the salamander letter was to detect, and it went through batteries of tests. And thinking about the implications of this, I actually went diving back down a rabbit hole that I haven't been to in well over a year now. Out of curiosity, I looked back into the historical veracity of the Justice Neely court document that calls Joseph Smith the Glass Looker. I was fascinated by this when I looked into it for the research on episode 12 of the show, but there was a fair amount of nuance that I had completely forgotten, a year after looking into it. I came to the question how we know that the Neely bill is real. Right? As the story goes, in 1971, Reverend Wesley P. Walters was rooting around in the basement of the county jail in Norwich, New York. While reading documents and digging through the files, Walter and his friend Fred Pofferl, I've never seen that last name before. Fred Pofferl discovered a piece of paper that had Justice Neely's bill for $2.68 for the trial of Joseph Smith, and it called him the Glass Looker on March 20th, 1826. It's one single piece of paper, unfortunately. It wasn't Neely's entire docket book like historians would have hoped for, but it is one piece of paper that these guys claim they found in the basement of a jail. Now, if you read through UTLM's piece about the document, they go through how the document reads exactly as we would expect. The dollar amount is exactly correct. The other names on other trials Neely heard that day match up perfectly with the historical record. The document checks out as being legitimate. This discovery happened in 1971. That's when Hofmann was 15 years old. I don't think he forged the document. But what if Walters forged it and then claimed that he found it in the basement? The pedigree for this document is basically an affidavit that these two guys found it. That's it. The pedigree for the Anthon transcript that Hofmann essentially made his name with was much more established than he just found it in a basement. Everything with the Anthon transcript is exactly like we would expect it to be, just like with the Neely bill, and Hofmann had even convinced a woman to sign an affidavit stating that Hofmann had bought a Bible from her mom that the transcript was conveniently inside of. Now, most of Hofmann's documents were just as well substantiated as the document that Walters found. Walters knew that a bill from Albert Neely might exist and found what he was looking for. Hofmann knew that an Anthon transcript might exist, and he reportedly found what he was looking for. The point is, I'm not so sure that the Neely bill is as trustworthy as I originally thought. Now, I have no reason to think that it was manufactured or forged by Wesley Walters, nor do I have any expertise or qualifications to question or verify the document as being legitimate. I'm merely pointing out the similarities between the Neely bill and many of Hofmann's documents and how hard it actually is to determine legitimacy of historical documents. If a forgery is good enough, it can pass a lot of tests, just like all of Hofmann's work had done for half of a decade before the bombs went off in 1985. Now, I think I've tracked down the primary problem with verifying these documents, and that is cost. Now, what I mean by that, it costed $6,000 for the initial investigation into the Salamander letter by Kenneth Rendell. And at the time, Stephen Christensen and Mark Hofmann split the bill because it was their private transaction. Now, Kenneth Rendell, the guy that billed them for $6,000, was just an old documents examiner. He wasn't a chemist or a forensics document examiner or anything. He could only look at the paper and the handwriting and say, it's period time paper, period time ink, and the handwriting looks legitimate. It doesn't look like a forgery. It costed them $6,000 to have a Kenneth Rendell say this, and that was $6,000. Even back then, that was a bargain for doing this in-depth examination of the Salamander letter by, a licensed and well-practiced document expert. When we go to the level of people like George Throckmorton and William Flynn, they examined the Salamander letter and other Hofmann's works because it was their job. It was a legal case the prosecution was bringing against Hofmann, and these men were hired to examine the documents by the state. Who knows what their bills were to the state for conducting such exhaustive and thorough analyses on hundreds of documents? Throckmorton and Flynn found the cracking in the ink, but that wasn't the only analysis that was done to prove that this was a forgery. They spent hundreds, possibly thousands of man-hours, billable man-hours that were billed to the state in examining Hofmann documents. And Throckmorton and Flynn that found the cracking in the ink, they weren't the only analysis that was done to prove that Hofmann's works were forgeries. Now, there was another test that was done, and I didn't understand it whatsoever when I happened upon it. So now I have to give a huge shout out to my friend Professor Stephen for helping me to understand what we're about to discuss. If you'd like, you can hear his voice as co-host of the currently on hiatus Atheists on Air. Now, Professor Stephen has been working in the field of mass spectrometry for years now. Right now, I think he examines urine samples for containing drugs, but basically, Professor Stephen is a really awesome chemical science communicator. He gave me a brief rundown of how electron microscopes work and how they were used to age the ink on the Salamander letter paper. Basically, an electron microscope requires shooting electrons at a surface and tracking how they bounce off of the thing that you're examining. It creates a nearly perfect image of the item at a molecular level, and also, it tells what kinds of atoms the electrons present in the thing that you're looking at. So they can tell by the way that the electrons bounce off what elements and what molecules are in whatever you're examining. Now, this is a very simplistic version, so please excuse my own lack of understanding with the description here. I don't know much about this. All I know is what Professor Stephen taught me here. But one man named Roderick J. McNeil conducted a study on thousands of old documents. Using a technique called a scanning auger microscopy, McNeil found that iron atoms in ink tend to leach into the paper as the document ages. So when ink is first put on paper, the iron atoms are much more concentrated. But as the years progress, however, those iron atoms migrate and basically soak into the paper, for lack of better terms. Now, to get into the nitty-gritty here, he found that over time, the iron atoms migrate 1/2000th of an inch over 1,000 years to the paper. So, to make an example out of that, if you look at a word that's on a piece of paper through an electron microscope once and then wait another 1,000 years and look at it again, the iron atoms will have moved 1/2000th of an inch. Now, an electron microscope can easily measure where on this 1,000 year time frame the ink is in relation to the paper, because the method of measurement is so incredibly precise when we're talking electron microscopes. Now, Hofmann used iron gall ink, which was in common use in the 1830s, and he had to basically make his own ink that would fit in with the time frame in which these documents were written. Well, in 1984, this study was done by a Roderick J. McNeil guy, and he conducted the study to date old documents. He took thousands of documents from 1200 up to 1972 and graded their deterioration on a curve that has held true for over 30 years since the study was conducted. Now, for technical purposes, and if you want to look it up, the study is called Scanning Auger Microscopy for Dating Manuscript Inks. It's not very creative, but that's a scientific study for you. There's going to be a link to the original study published in the show notes, so follow the link if you understand what we're talking about and want to know more information. But there's really a lot of great information in the study, and this is where I really have to thank Professor Stephen, because he read through it and he shared some of the highlights. But to put it short, the technique is extremely reliable, some considering it virtually infallible in dating ink. With every document that McNeil examined, he did so 10 times in different locations to make sure the tests were precise. He achieved a 90% accuracy rating in the study and was able to estimate dates of documents with a plus or minus 2.2 year of margin. The older stuff tested from all the way back in like 1050 proved to be a little bit more challenging. McNeil was only able to date plus or minus 30 years there. So the accuracy kind of moves along a curve as the document ages more and more. But still, this is insanely accurate for chemical aging ink on documents, or aging how the ink leaches into the paper itself. If you want a complete understanding of what I'm talking about, look into the book Detecting Forgery, written by Joe Nickel. It apparently goes through the entire process and how it was used to determine that the Howard Hughes autobiography by Clifford Irving was a forgery, as well as details a bunch of work that was done on various Hofmann documents that showed themselves as forgeries once they were examined with this microscopy technique. Now you might say, well, if Hofmann just would have used old iron to mix the ink, it would have aged proportionally with the paper and it would have passed that test. So his forgeries could have passed, one more test like this. But that's not what this test looks at. The test doesn't look at the ink itself. It doesn't date the ink itself. It dates how long the ink has been in contact with the paper with an accuracy of plus or minus 2.2 years. And it's held extremely accurate when it's used on documents from current all the way up to 800 years ago. Now, Roderick examined the salamander letter in mid-1986, and he concluded the ink hadn't been on the paper any time before 1970. He used this study of scanning auger microscopy to determine this massive document dating study in 1984, and 2 years after the study was done, his scientific technique was used as evidence to convict Hofmann and other frauds. This is how science wins, and it's pretty awesome if you ask me. This is how you can do science on old documents, on history, by documenting whether or not it's a forgery by testing how long the ink has been in contact with the paper. That's so cool. I love that stuff. But I have to say, the dramatic irony here is the fact that Roderick MacNeil initially developed it to try and prove that the Shroud of Turin is real. And he's published 2 books on it. Surprisingly enough, the study was inconclusive, but it should also be pointed out, but this technique that he used, that he studied, and that he created the study in 1984 off of, they're still widely in use today in document forensics. It's not like the guy was a quack and he conducted some crazy study that was used for a little bit and now it's just thrown by the wayside. No, he did some real hard science and it's still in use today. I just did a bad job of explaining it, that's all. Now, the overall point that got us into talking about document aging and to what extent these documents were studied is cost. We're talking about lack of resources and lack of funding being a huge problem in determining forgeries. Now, MacNeil, the guy that conducted the study in 1984 and then studied the Salamander letter in 1986, had access to an electron microscope and his body of work that had probably cost his funding agency obscene amounts of money to conduct. Even the microscope or the mass spectrometer alone were probably a few $100,000 in the 1980s. Now, in order to get an expert like MacNeil or Throckmorton or Flynn to do research and use extremely advanced equipment to do so, somebody has to pay them. It was the state that was doing it at this time because it was a criminal case. But you can be sure that the $6,000 that paid Rendell to examine the Salamander letter wouldn't fund 45 minutes of these guys' work. That was a private deal between Steve Christensen and Mark Hofmann, and they anteed up the $6,000, $3,000 a piece to pay Rendell to do it. But that wouldn't get anything done with these experts because they're on a whole different level. They're at the forensics level, not just the document examination level. So now we kind of begin to open up a huge discussion about ethics and money. Who pays for MacNeil to look at every Mormon document to determine if it's a real or if it's a forgery? Who determines what documents MacNeil should examine and what documents aren't important enough to be examined? I mean, if we ran every prominent historical document through this same study, through this same rigorous level of examination, what might be revealed about the historical record that we've taken granted for so long? See, these are big questions with no easy answers. Questions that require discussion at another time, probably in another place. But for now, let's kind of get back on topic here. Let's get back to Hofmann and try and advance his storyline through 1986. The evidence was really mounting, and his collapsed house of cards was lying in a motionless heap as people rooted through his past to uncover Hofmann's crimes. On February 4th, 1986, prosecutors charge Hofmann with 2 murder counts, 23 counts of theft by deception, and communications fraud involving, among others, the Anthon transcript, Harris letter, and non-existent McClellan collection. And that's when Hofmann goes to Salt Lake County Jail. The next day, probable cause statements were released listing Hofmann documents involved in fraud counts. Investigator George Throckmorton says that none of the documents described are authentic. All of them were frauds. Those were the 21 that he talked about earlier. Then on February 7th, Kenneth Rendell says that several Hofmann documents are forgeries, but he's not sure about the Harris letter. And prominent LDS historians with only media reports about the case for fraud to counter earlier reports showing authenticity maintain the view that some of the documents are authentic. That's the thing. So much ink had been given to the Salamander letter as being real, as well as other Hofmann documents, that the only thing that people were going off of, the only thing that media reports were going off of was, well, these, we've understood the Salamander letter to be real for a year and a half now, but now we have this guy, Kenneth Rendell, coming along saying that it's real, and then George Throckmorton saying that it's not real, and we don't really know what to think here. And then, of course, it was later on in 1986 that Roderick MacNeil studied it, so that actually has yet to come out too. But on February 9th, Hofmann was released from jail on $250,000 bail. You really wonder where he got that money. Maybe it was just a bond or a loan or something, but that's just crazy amounts of money. Then on February 11th, the Salt Lake Tribune quotes James R. Debowski, who was a former director of the U.S. Postal Crime Lab in Cincinnati, and he was contending that the Joseph Smith III blessing document was genuine. So people were still coming out. Basically, people were convicting Hofmann, or, the prosecution had charged him with crimes of being, involved in 2 murder counts and theft and fraud. And people were still coming out all over the place, document examiners, people that were in the know, people that had spent their lives examining documents, saying that a lot of the documents that Hofmann was dealing in are still legitimate. I'm glad that the historical record played out how it did, and we're looking at this 30 years in hindsight, because who knows what we would think if we were looking at this as it was going about. I mean, I'm confused with it right now, and I'm looking back at it 30 years in the past. I'm able to use historical hindsight of 2020 and see what happened, and I'm confused. I can't even imagine what these people were going through at this time. So then, finally, in April of '86, prosecutors examine 40 witnesses and collect evidence to build their case against Mark Hofmann. Now, on the 1st of April, the church announced that it's returning court documents that were received from Hofmann to Hancock County, Illinois. The announcement also listed 48 documents acquired from Mark Hofmann. 41 were by donation or trade, and 7 were purchased for the total of $57,000. So the church finally came out with a bunch of documents saying, okay, all of these we got from Hofmann. You guys take a look at them, tell us what you think. And then on April 4th, 3 days later, Hofmann was charged with 4 additional accounts of theft by deception. I mean, things were really starting to pile on top of him. Then finally, on April 11th, George Throckmorton examined a copy of Oath of a Freeman loaned to police by Wilding. This was the Oath of a Freeman. We talked about this a bunch last episode, but this was Hofmann's magnum opus. If this deal would have gone through, that was a $1.5 million right in his pocket that he really needed. But after Throckmorton examined it, he saw the cracking ink, and he said that it was a fake that was printed from a negative that was made in Salt Lake City. Everything came crashing down here. Not only the church, but collectors everywhere were coming out of the woodwork claiming that they had done business with Hofmann. Maybe they purchased a couple of signatures from him, maybe a Deseret banking note or a land deed. Maybe they traded a poem or some old books or a single important document. Damage had been done. Damage to the Mormon historical record at an incomprehensible level had been wreaked upon the trusting minds and pocketbooks of people involved in that world. Deals had been made and possessions had changed hands. How would you feel if you had purchased something from a document dealer for $10,000 only to find out that he had picked it up in a trade from a guy who had purchased it along with other letters, who had purchased it from another guy who had acquired that through a trade from Mark Hofmann? A lot of these people had documents that originally came from Hofmann, but they didn't find out about the line of possession the document had experienced to know that it was from Hofmann in the first place. A lot of dealers that had Hofmann documents in their hands knew that they had bought it from one guy, but they didn't know that, 5 people further on down the line led right back to Mark Hofmann. Mark Hofmann's basement specifically, that he had manufactured the document. It was so muddy. There was no telling exactly what was and what wasn't a Hofmann document. And now we begin to ask even more ethical questions here. Who pays everybody back in that line of possession for the forgery? Who loses money because they bought the forgery? And if they got it in a trade, who gets what book or document back in what trade when a Hofmann forgery is in the mix? I mean, was it the responsibility of every single person who had ever dealt with Hofmann to come forward and offer up their documents to be tested for legitimacy? And if so, who pays for the thousands of hours necessary for testing to identify these forgeries? Was it the person's responsibility to track down every single document they'd ever bought from Hofmann to let the buyer know that they may have purchased a forgery? I mean, Brent Ashworth claimed that Hofmann sold him $225,000 worth of forgeries. Who pays him back for that? I mean, Hofmann was responsible for a small chunk of the debt that required CFS to file for bankruptcy that was $5 million in debt to its investors. Who pays for all the damage done with CFS? I mean, the LDS Church had returned the Book of Commandments that they got in trade with for the Joseph Smith III blessing to the RLDS Church. That was a relatively simple way to reverse the damage, right? It was just one trade, one thing for one other. Oh, we found out that ours is a forgery, we're going to give it back. But the majority of other trades that Hofmann had done weren't that simple. These are some of the complicated situations, all stemming from the damage that Hofmann had done in a mere 6 years' time. So finally, on April 14th, the preliminary hearing in the case of the state of Utah versus Mark Hofmann begins. By April 18th, investigators had shown that Mark Hofmann used an alias of Mike Hansen, and that Mike Hansen had bought bomb ingredients and engraving plates used to print some of the documents that were sold by Hofmann. And on the same day, the former LDS archivist Don Schmidt testifies that the church took few steps to authenticate documents obtained from Hofmann, indicating that most of the documents were examined solely on the basis of their historical context. And that was a very big problem. Right there, the former LDS archivist Don Schmidt, who had purchased plenty of documents from Hofmann, said that the church didn't really take many steps to verify that these were authentic. Most of them were purchased just because Hofmann was bringing them up, and the church knew that they could trust Hofmann. That's a huge problem. Then, during all of these proceedings, Hofmann, on April 23rd, fell in his home, and he actually broke his kneecap that had been pretty much destroyed in the explosion. The hearing, because this has happened, the hearing was postponed until May 5th, and he was bound to a wheelchair for another couple of weeks after that. But this gives us a sense for the chaos that was ensuing. The realm of Mormon history was reeling at these revelations that the church had purchased or traded to Hofmann so many documents and other items, and that so many documents might be forgeries. We're talking a lot of money given to buy forgeries, possibly for the sake of suppressing them. And the church had to come out and say publicly that they had been so wildly duped by Hofmann. These men that are prophets, seers, and revelators, that are incapable of leading the church astray and have the power of discernment, have been fooled by one sophisticated con man. All of them. So, in May 1986, there was a Brigham Young University Studies special issue, and it focused on the tests that the Martin Harris and Smith letters had been subjected to, and focused also on issues that were raised by the letters, including treasure hunting in and before Joseph Smith's time, based on non-Hofmann sources. So, they were starting to embrace the idea that maybe the Salamander letter wasn't real, but they were still not fully buying it yet. So on May 3rd, there was a Mormon History Association annual meetings in Salt Lake City, and there was a special session held on early Mormon history, and the papers by Ronald Walker and Alan Taylor were later published in the winter of 1986. And at this meeting, Richard Lloyd Anderson made a slide lecture presentation on the Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith revelation letter and on other documents, showing that there are problems with the postmark. So people were still studying Hofmann forgeries and saying, so, maybe there isn't cracked ink, but this postmark doesn't look quite right. This wax seal on the Salamander letter, that's in the wrong place. The Salamander letter doesn't seem like it's folded quite right. This document looks like it was cut with scissors from a larger sheet of paper, but we wouldn't expect that if it actually came from the 1830s. So, they were being openly discussed by historians in and out of the church. The Salamander letter was still being questioned, and talks of other existing Hofmann documents were surfacing. Oddly enough, though, talks about the McClellan collection seemed absent from what I've been reading lately. Now, the McClellan collection was what really, that was Hofmann's Achilles heel. That was the final straw that broke him. And after talks about the papyri from the McClellan collection had died off, anybody that was talking about the whole collection surfacing seemed occupied with everything else that was going on. They were taking steps back instead of looking forward to the McClellan collection. So on May 7th, 1986, William Flynn, investigator for Arizona State Crime Lab, announces that he found the crack inked that proved that the Harris letter, the Salamander letter, and that other documents were forgeries. That's when it finally blew up, that Throckmorton and Flynn had found this, that there was definite evidence that we could see these documents are forgeries. And then by the end of May, Hofmann was bound over to Utah 3rd District Court for trial on charges of murder and fraud. On June 6th, he pled not guilty to all of the charges, and judges ruled that Hofmann would face 5 separate trials. The first for murder, which was scheduled March 2nd, 1987, almost a year in the future. And still, in the spring of 1986, there were still many unanswered questions floating around about, how Hofmann had passed the polygraph test and why he was coming under so much scrutiny when the evidence really wasn't mounting in favor of Hofmann being the bomber. But that was based only on what the public had been told and in the media reports. There were still a lot of people that were reluctant to agree with the prosecution's case, even though they hadn't gone through everything that the prosecution had gone through. They hadn't seen all of the evidence that the prosecution was collecting that pointed to Hofmann being the lone bomber. So this is when it happened in the summer and fall of 1986. That's when Roderick McNeil used his scanning auger microscope to examine the age of the ink on the documents. That's when he concluded that none of Hofmann's documents were written before 1970. And that was the final nail in the coffin that we needed for the forgeries. And finally, on October 16th, 1986, the church announced that a search of its archives and First Presidency's vault shows that there is no Oliver Cowdery history in their possession. Now, this is a very interesting press release. The Oliver Cowdery history was a rumor that the church just couldn't kill. Since the rumor was popularized in May of 85, that the church was hiding the Oliver Cowdery history, no amount of press releases could satisfy the public's salivation for this document. Add in the fact that less than a month before Hofmann told the press that the church was hiding the Oliver Cowdery history, the fact that the church was hiding the existence of the 1825 Smith and Stowell letter, and public trust of the church's statements were at an all-time low. If they were hiding something as small as a business contract between Joseph Smith's father and Josiah Stowell, why wouldn't they hide something as incriminating as the Cowdery history that credits Alvin Smith with finding the gold plates instead of Joseph Smith? That seems like a legitimate question even today. Let's read a little bit from that press release and see what we can glean from it. There's a link to this archived photocopy newspaper for October 16th, 1986 in the show notes. So there, follow it to page B1 to find the story from which I'm reading right here. The headline says, "No early history by Cowdery found. After months of research, officials of the Historical Department of the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have concluded there is no substance to a widely circulated rumor that it owns a very early history of the church written by Oliver Cowdery. Cowdery was an early associate of Joseph Smith and the church's first historian. However, the church does own a little-known draft of Joseph Smith's published history that some people have, apparently mistakenly assumed to be the Cowdery history," according to Richard E. Turley, Jr., Assistant Managing Director of the Historical Department. Though the first part of the draft is missing, the extant written pages cover the period from the baptism of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery up through the first several months of the church's organization. Because the period covered by this small draft overlaps the period thought to be covered by the purported Cowdery history, some people have assumed the draft must be Cowdery's early history. However, the document's internal evidence, such as reference to the second edition of the Book of Mormon, shows it was written much later than the purported Cowdery history, Turley said. Although he would not speculate about who may have pinned the draft, he said the contents closely follow corresponding pages of Volume 1 of the Documentary History of the Church. The draft makes no reference to salamanders, nor does it attribute a greater role in the church history to Alvin Smith, brother of the prophet Joseph Smith, than does the published history. The church's second official historian, John Whitmer, wrote that his predecessor, Oliver Cowdery, had written the commencement of the church's history, commencing at the time of the finding of the plates. up to June 12, 1831. Over the years, many scholars have interpreted the historical evidence to show that the church never obtained the Cowdery history from the writer himself or his successor. A careful search of the historical collections of the church now corroborates this conclusion. In late 19th century, church historian Franklin D. Richards and his staff tried unsuccessfully to locate the Oliver Cowdery history. For several years in the 1890s, they corresponded and visited with Missouri resident George Schweich, who they thought might own such a history, a grandson of David Whitmer, who in turn was a brother-in-law of Oliver Cowdery. Schweich owned some important historical documents, including the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon and the John Whitmer history. For a time, Elder Richards and his staff believed Schweich owned the Cowdery history. Ultimately, however, they were disappointed. When assistant church historian Andrew Jensen visited Missouri in 1893, Schweich gave him access to historical materials and allowed him to copy the John Whitmer history. In reporting his successes to Elder Richards, Jensen also noted in disappointment that Schweich did not own the Oliver Cowdery history. In an 1893 report to Elder Richards, Jensen wrote, Mr. Schweich rather conveyed the idea that the Oliver Cowdery heirs in Southwest City, Missouri had Oliver Cowdery's old papers, but he did not know. When Oliver Cowdery died in 1850, he was survived by his wife, Elizabeth Ann Whitmer Cowdery, and a daughter, Maria Ann Louise Cowdery, who eventually married but had no children. Oliver's widow and daughter both died in Southwest City in 1892, leaving Oliver without descendants. Extant correspondence of Maria Louise indicate that the family burned Oliver's old papers, finding them too cumbersome to carry on their many moves. Burning documents, no. Despite this historical evidence, some people have speculated that two statements of former church historian Joseph Fielding Smith demonstrate the church owns the history. In 1925, Joseph Fielding Smith wrote, Oliver Cowdery was the first one appointed to assist Joseph in transcribing and keeping a history of the church. John Whitmer took his place when Oliver Cowdery was given something else to do. We have on file in the historian's office the records written in the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery, the first historian or recorder of the church. So that kind of sounds like they have the history in their hands. In 1947, Joseph Fielding Smith described early Oliver Cowdery records in more detail. The earliest records of the church are in the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery. He acted as a scribe and recorder, generally in the early conferences of the church. These minutes and items of doctrine are recorded in manuscript books now filed in the historian's office. They are invaluable. At first glance, these statements seem to imply church ownership of the early Oliver Cowdery history. However, employees of the church historical department have carefully searched the church's historical collections, including the First Presidency vault, and have found no evidence that the church ever obtained the early Oliver Cowdery history. No such record appears on any past or present inventories, catalogs, or other lists of the church's collections. None of the people most familiar with these collections remembers ever having seen such an item in church possession. Several interviews with outside scholars have also failed to turn up any evidence of church ownership. Elder Joseph Fielding Smith's statements likely refer to records that are already well known to scholars. In the more detailed of his two statements, Elder Smith described the church-owned Oliver Cowdery history as minutes and items of doctrine. Scholars of church history are familiar with a number of manuscript volumes that contain entries made by Oliver Cowdery himself or copied from notes taken directly by him. One such volume is the Far West Record, which was published in 1983 by permission of the First Presidency of the Church. The scribes who compiled this volume copied it into loose sheets of minutes that had accumulated during the first few years of the church's organization, including the minutes of the earliest church conferences, which were kept by Oliver Cowdery. As faithful copyists, the scribes also copied into the volume the names of the clerks who had signed the now lost original minutes. It appears likely that Elder Smith assumed the copied minutes were originals in Oliver's hand, because the minutes for which Oliver served as clerk bear his name. Other historical evidence also shows Elder Smith's statements did not refer to the early Oliver Cowdery history. Between the years that he made his two statements, Elder Smith received a letter from James H. Moyle, who was serving as president of the church's Eastern States Mission. Moyle wrote that he was studying in detail the history of the prophet Joseph Smith, and asked when Joseph Smith's own story of the first vision was first reduced to writing and when it was first published. That was 1832. In describing the various accounts of the church's earliest days, Elder Smith replied, Oliver Cowdery wrote the first account of these earliest scenes in a number of letters which were published in the Messenger and Advocate, and as he received the information from the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith. Later in the letter, Elder Smith wrote, the prophet was not given to writing in those early days, and it was by verbal communication that his story was told to members of his family and others until after the organization of the church. Then it was that Oliver Cowdery undertook to tell the story. In this letter to Moyle, a trusted church official, Elder Smith shows his belief that the first narrative history of the church's earliest days was a history published by Oliver Cowdery in the Messenger and Advocate. Thus, the letter underscores the conclusion that Elder Smith's statements about early Oliver Cowdery records referred to volumes such as the Far West Record, not the early Oliver Cowdery history mentioned by John Whitmer. That's the end of the article. And they sure seem to be pretty emphatic when it came to denying that they have this Oliver Cowdery history in their possession or even that it exists. Basically, they equated it and wrote it off, saying that the history that we're talking about, the early Oliver Cowdery history, was actually people referring to the Far West Record that was initially published in 1838 in the Messenger and Advocate that now comprises the History of the Church, Volume 1, which is... yeah, I don't think that's quite accurate. The earliest history that we're talking about that Joseph Smith actually wrote was 1832. The Oliver Cowdery history that historians are talking about and referring to that the church is, wholesale denying that they even know about is something that was written before 1832. It was something maybe written from early 1830 from the hand of Oliver Cowdery when the church itself was founded. People are trying to find that, and that's the account that supposedly has Alvin Smith as being credited with finding the gold plates as opposed to Joseph Smith. Now, I'm not really sure how to interpret this whole thing. And, given everything that I've read up to this point and how much the church was trying to categorically deny the existence of this, my own biases of distrusting the church are probably clouding my judgment here. But let me give you an example. When a child tells you straightforward that they didn't draw on the wall, and in fact, they don't even have a crayon that's the color of the writing that's on the wall, that claim seems a little spurious, right? If a large company emphatically claims in public statements that it's not doing any underhand business deals in Panama, it may be a good idea to check their books. And thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that those happened. If the government says that it's doing things for your protection, and then you see a newspaper article that presents evidence that they funded terrorist activities in Nicaragua and Afghanistan and other places, that first part of that claim seems a little bit spurious, doesn't it? See the newspaper article that I quoted from. That article is earlier on in the newspaper that I talked about. Just go to the show links. It's in there. It's in the show notes. But my point is, if Hofmann claimed that the church had something that they didn't want to share, he was usually able to make that claim and have it backed up by reality, because he had personally manufactured and sold or traded it to them. I made this point last episode. Hofmann didn't just recklessly try to make the church look foolish, he was calculated in doing so. And I would think that he wouldn't have leaked to the press that the Cowdery history exists if it didn't exist in the first place. My research has led me to believe that the church has the Cowdery history, probably penned by Hofmann himself. It was probably a forgery. And it continues to suppress it. The church continues to suppress this Oliver Cowdery history, inflicting a massive disservice to the Mormon historical community and barring us from unearthing yet another Hofmann document. The church was claiming very emphatically that they don't have a Cowdery history, and Hofmann at this time was behind bars. He was unable to construct any elaborate scenario to force their hand, as he had done so many times in the past. But it makes me wonder, what else the church may have locked away in their vaults that are nothing more than Hofmann forgeries? That they're hiding, that they won't talk about, that we'll never know about. But of course, this is my own opinion. This is my personal opinion, and it's heavily influenced by the research that I've done so far and the sources that I've taken this from. I choose not to trust church officials and historians at their word, because I've been burned by doing so in the past. I personally haven't been through the archives like they claim they have, nor have I seen the president's vault like they claim they have, so I'm much less informed in this circumstance. If only I could root around in the church's basement. I'd love to see that. Anyway, let's finish off with Hofmann's timeline here. In early October of 1986, the Tanners of the UTLM released their first copy of Tracking the White Salamander. That's been my primary source for so much of what's gone into the research for these episodes. If all of the forensic and authorship analyses hadn't done it by this point, publishing this book was the final nail in the Salamander letter's coffin. It put everything to rest and detailed so much of Hofmann's work and his interactions with the Tanner. And finally, by late 1986, Hofmann threw in the towel. In early December of 86, Hofmann's defense attorney Yangich and prosecutor Stott begin open discussions about a plea bargain. And then on January 7th, a plea bargain was agreed to. Then the following day, Stott and David Biggs drive to Yangich's home in Salt Lake City, and Hofmann confesses his crimes to them. That was when it happened. January 7th to 8th, the plea bargain was reached, and the prosecutors sat down with Hofmann and his attorney, and he confessed his crimes. And then on January 22nd, Yangich did something that is probably a good thing, and it was necessary to do at the time, but it must have been very, very hard. He forced Mark Hofmann to confront his family with his guilt. He gathered his family together, told them about it, and his family was heartbroken. There was a quote that I found at some point, I can't find it right now, but Hofmann said that he was doing a lot of this to protect his family because he didn't want to be exposed, basically, to his wife, his parents, to his children. He didn't want them to know that he was the man he was, the con man. So talking to his family and confronting them with what he's done was probably something very hard for Hofmann to do. From what I've understood, reading through some of Hofmann's later interview, it sounds like his dad was pretty broken up about it and denied everything. But by January 23rd, the plea bargain was announced. This is 1987 now. Hofmann pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of communication fraud involving the Harris Letter and McClellan papers. 26 other accounts were dismissed, and Hofmann agreed to be interviewed about the murders and documents. That was a big part of the plea bargain, is he had to agree to be interviewed about everything. After that, he went to the Utah State Prison, and belief continues among some historians that not all Hofmann-related documents were forgeries. This was the end of Hofmann to the legal system. After so much work went into amassing evidence to prove his guilt, after 40 interviews were conducted with witnesses, and the threat of 5 separate trials were hanging over Hofmann's head, he signed a plea bargain and was sentenced to life plus 20 in the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah, narrowly avoiding the death penalty. After all the damage he'd done, Hofmann did something noble. He agreed to be interviewed about everything. From mid-February to the end of May in 1987, a battery of interviews was conducted on Hofmann so he could hopefully shed some light on his dealings. He was finally beaten. Dory Olds, his wife, had filed for divorce. Hofmann was on the hook for life in prison with no hope of parole. He had lost his home, his family, friends, business acquaintances, and his freedom. The last thing Hofmann could do for humanity was give us information about the damage he'd caused and the appalling amount of work that he'd done. After the interviews were conducted, a 600-page report was released containing nearly every word spoken between Hofmann and his interviewers. Ever since this book was released, Hofmann has gone dark. Very soon after it, he attempted to kill himself in the jail, unsuccessfully. There was a letter that was found, written by him, that listed off a bunch of his forgeries, from which we take a lot of the lists of what we know what his forgeries are. But now Hofmann only takes visits from his ex-wife and children, and he refuses to give any interviews or sign licensing away to have a movie made about him. Well, I'm very excited to announce that Mark Hofmann, the Mark Hofmann, has agreed to break his vow of silence for an exclusive world first podcast interview. I'm so excited about this. Believe it or not, the Salt Lake City Correctional Facility was nice enough to organize transportation and security measures, and Mark is sitting right here in my living room with me. Mark, thanks so much for making the trip out here and for doing this interview for the first time in 30 years.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This is going to be a pretty standard interview. Do you mind answering a few questions about yourself?
Yeah, but I don't want to be away from myself for too long, so let's get to it.
Sounds good, Mark. Okay, so, you're credited with being one of the most prolific and professional document forgers out there. Your work spans from signatures of prominent historical figures, Mormon or otherwise, to banknotes, to even some Kinderhook plates. I mean, you forged 2 copies of the earliest known document printed in America, that's the Oath of a Freeman, and you even claim to have work from Edgar Allan Poe and a Charles Dickens manuscript. I just have to ask, when did you get started with the hobby of forging things?
Well, when I was 15, I electroplated a rare mint mark on a coin, making it worth several $1,000s. I took the coin to a dealer who sent it to the U.S. Treasury in Washington, D.C., which pronounced it as authentic. My rationalization was that if the Treasury Department pronounces it as genuine, then it is genuine by my definition. I devised the plan to manufacture and sell documents to the church while I was on my mission. I'm an atheist now.
Interesting. So you actually got started a lot earlier than I thought.
I had been forging for 22 years. That's all I thought about. Sometime around 1979, I was talking with A.J. Simmons about a book called The Word. The plot of the book centers around a forgery of the 5th Gospel of Jesus, the Gospel of James. He jokingly said that when he retires, he'll forge the ultimate Nauvoo diary and then sell it to BYU. We both laughed at the time, but he didn't realize I was doing it already. I've been doing this since I was 12 years old.
Wow, that's remarkable. So, what really got you interested in Mormon history specifically and making these forgeries?
The more I studied about Joseph Smith and his writing, the better I got.
So it really was just a fascination with Joseph Smith and Mormon history, then you began making forgeries.
Whenever I needed money, I thought up something to forge. I would think, what would Joseph Smith say in this situation? I would just put myself in his shoes and say whatever I thought he would say.
Huh, wow. Fair enough. So tell me about your first real forgery. I mean, this is the second anointing blessing that you supposedly found.
Oh, that was a crude forgery. I used some of the words in Doctrine and Covenants, section 124, and said what I thought Joseph Smith probably would have said. I knew Joseph Smith was deeply involved in temple rights at the time, and thought he would probably use language similar to the language found in section 124.
So after that, you came out with the Anthon transcript, supposedly written by Joseph Smith, showing the characters that were on the golden plates. And as the history goes, the David Whitmer characters manuscript was actually copied from this, if I'm not mistaken.
I wanted mine to look like it came first, and the others were copied from it. I used the Whitmer version and just added a few flourishes to make it look different.
Wow, interesting. So tell me a little bit about the church and the salamander letter.
I thought it would be worth more money than I got. I also thought the church would try to hide it.
Well, do you see how some people might claim that you are changing Mormon history by creating this salamander letter?
I won't go as far to say I wanted to change Mormon history. Well, let me take that back. Maybe I did. In effect, I guess the questions I asked myself in deciding on a forgery, one of the questions was, what could have been? I had a concept of church history, and I followed that concept. Initially, it was more of the fame involved, although I thought all along that it would be sold, and the more publicity I got, the better.
So, I mean, did fame really have that much to do with it? Or was it also that you just like to bamboozle people by making them believe a lie? Whether it was a lie you told them directly to that person or a lie in the form of a document or something that you forged.
I'm an expert. I've done it hundreds of times. It's hard to be humble when you're as great as I am. I can look a person in the eye and lie. I can fool anybody. Obviously, if I would have known they would someday be detected, I wouldn't have done it.
I think that speaks volumes to your initial motivations for doing this. Possible delusions of grandeur and, just a con man personality. You just enjoyed fooling people. So tell me about what landed you in prison, basically. I want to know about the bombings specifically. Why Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets?
Well, I first considered killing Thomas Wilding, or Brent Ashworth, then the second bomb would kill me. Then I finally targeted Christensen. The bomb at the Sheets home was simply a diversion so that everyone would believe that the bombings were a result of CFS business problems.
Oh, I also wanted to ask, maybe this is the wrong question, but why bombs? I mean, why not kill the people in some other, less messy way, if you know what I mean?
I was attracted to bombs as a murder weapon because then I wouldn't have to be present when the bombs were detonated. I didn't think I could pull a gun trigger if I had to face my victims, but I could kill if I didn't have to be around when it happened.
Wow, how incredibly cowardly and heartless of you. So Gary Sheets was just collateral damage then, a diversion, and effectively his wife who actually suffered the wrath of the bomb?
I don't even remember meeting Sheets. I had to look up his address in the phone book before I delivered the bomb. It didn't matter to me if the Sheets bomb went off or not because its purpose was to establish a diversion. For this purpose, the death was not necessary. I realized, of course, that the bomb left at the house could kill or severely injure someone, but it really didn't matter to me.
Now, do you see how some might take something like that and paint you as a sadist or a psychopath in some way? When you have no regard for human life. Maybe some of those horrible things that people have said about you are more accurate than I initially understood. Now, I'm trying to understand the man, Mark Hofmann here. Not the murderer, not the bomber, not the forger, the person. Give me something to humanize you here, Mark. Give me something to work with.
Well, the night before the bombings, it took me about 2 hours to make the bombs in my basement. I went and placed the first bomb in front of Gary's house around 3 in the morning. When I got home, my daughter woke up, so I went and took care of her until she went back to sleep. I stayed by her side. A few hours later, I went and dropped off the bomb at the judge building for Stephen. Before I walked into the building to drop off the bomb for Steve, I took off my gloves and threw them in the trash can outside.
Why would you do that?
To test fate.
Wow. I mean, you may be a murderer, but you still obviously love your family, and you're a real human being, and obviously you'd do anything to help your family. Even amidst being an active killer, you stayed up at 3:30 in the morning with your daughter to make sure she fell asleep. I mean, you literally did that in between dropping off 2 bombs to take away other people's lives. Now, from what I understand, telling your family about the forgeries was the hardest thing you ever had to do.
The day the plea bargain was announced, my father, William, kept saying, "Mark is an innocent boy." It was really hard on my family. When Mac Christensen, Steve's dad, saw my father in the courtroom, he said to my father that his family's love is with my family. And it made my dad cry.
Wow. It's powerful stuff. So walk me through the next day, Mark. The bombs had gone off in the judge building and at the Sheets residency, brutally murdering 2 very good people. Now tell me about the bomb going off in your car.
The explosion in the sports car was a suicide attempt. The next day I went to Logan to buy parts for the 3rd bomb. I assembled it in Logan Canyon, making it substantially larger than the others because I wanted a quick and clean death.
So, people People might say that you were part of a conspiracy and that you were bombed by somebody else and, when you got in the car and you only went to jail to take the fall. Now, I don't believe any of these claims because I think you were plenty capable of orchestrating all this by yourself. But tell me...
I acted alone in everything I did.
Okay, well, I suppose that answers the question I was going to ask. So people paint you as a heartless, sadistic atheist with no sense of morality. Even your mission diaries show that you have problems with the church and belief in God. What would you say to people that claim you did this and have no morals because you're an atheist?
I never cheated anybody if they thought what they were buying was authentic. As long as the buyer believed it to be true, then it was authentic. That's how I treat belief in the church. If you believe in it, it's true for you, and it doesn't seem to matter what others say.
Yeah, well... Once again, I just have to say, I think that paints you as like a nihilistic sadist with no remorse for your actions. I mean, don't you see how creating forgeries is a problem and destroys the trusted historical record? Don't you see the damage that you did with every fraudulent document you sold or traded away? You made people believe in things that aren't true. We can condemn the truth claims of the LDS Church by sticking to the facts, by reporting what actually happened, but you would rather manufacture your own history with these documents you forged. You cheated everybody. You did untold damage to the trustworthiness of the historical record. How can you think you have any moral high ground here?
I want to clarify all of this, how all of this fraud and stuff took place. My view is, when I forged a document and sold it, I was not cheating that person that I was selling it to because the document would never be detected as being a fraud. I didn't feel like I was cheating people because I always intended to give them what they wanted, their money's worth.
That's probably the most horrible thing I've heard you say this far. Belief in something doesn't make it true. People have been believing in God for millennia, and none of their beliefs have made God true. You manufactured a false reality and sold it as fact. You took existing evidence around you and constructed a narrative that you were comfortable with and then sold that narrative to people for obscene amounts of money. You created a lifestyle built on lies. You, sir, are no better than any pastor, holy man, shaman, faith healer, or prophet. On top of that, you killed 2 people right before you nearly killed yourself. I've been reading up on you for a while, Mark, and at some level, I admire your work. You forced the church to confront things in its history that the leadership wanted to keep locked away forever. You began conversations about Joseph Smith in households that had never come to question the occult rituals the man practiced. You did so much to help expose the lengths the church would go to in order to conceal the skeletons in their closet. You forced the church to open up their vault and, more importantly, their pocketbooks, and dared them to do exactly what you expected them to do. You've done such good work to help the field of Mormon history. But the cost of your work, the deaths, the ruined families, the 7 parentless children your actions caused, Mark. Your own family and friends that will never see you or talk to you again. The havoc you wreaked on the trust of Mormon scholars and historians for decades. The cost was simply too much. I can't think of any other way you could have had better results, but the cost of those results and the devastation left in the wake of your actions was just not worth it. I mean, I don't really have anything else to add, but if there's one last thing you could share with the listeners that would shed some light on who the real Mark Hofmann is, what would it be?
Well, when I was a young child, I was given a metal detector. I took some friends out into the field to look for money and found a jar of coins. They were amazed. Little did they know I had gone into the field earlier and buried the coins so we could find them.
Well, Mark, I have a lot to say about that, but I'm afraid that our time has come to a close. Thank you for breaking your vow of silence and, traveling all the way up to Seattle to talk with me today. I wish you would sign the rights over so, we could make a movie about you or something. People would love it, but oh well. Goodbye, Mark.
Goodbye.
Well, that was an enlightening interview to say the least, and, jeez, what a surprise to have the actual Mark Hofmann in my living room to interview, breaking a nearly 30-year vow of silence, am I right? Whew, it's intense stuff. Well, to get back into the details of the aftermath of this, the people that were examining his documents were primarily George Throckmorton and William Flynn. Throckmorton had put 120 hours into studying the salamander letter before he found the cracked ink that was the giveaway. He, along with a few other document forensic experts, spent thousands of man-hours poring over documents Hofmann had bought or sold. Out of 443 documents that they examined, they found that 268 or 60% of them were authentic, 107 24% were definite forgeries, and that 68 of them, or 15%, were undetermined. Of those 443 documents, 48 had been bought or sold to the church, and the rest were among multiple private collectors. That's what made Hofmann so hard to nail down. 60% of the documents that he had touched were completely authentic. 24% were definite forgeries, and 15% of them, they couldn't figure out if they were forgeries or not, even after discovering the cracked ink. What's even crazier is they were able to determine when he had changed a document easier than they were able to identify a document that he had written from start to finish. One of the last documents that he had was a land deed between Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon from 1822. Well, originally, it was an actual legitimate document that was signed with the name Asa Spaulding, dated in 1792, before Sidney Rigdon was even born, and then Hofmann changed the date to read 1822 and wrote in Sidney Rigdon's signature and penned a Solomon Spaulding underneath Asa Spaulding, with 1822 being a date after Spaulding's death in 1816. So it was much easier to identify this legitimate old document that Hofmann had changed as a forgery than it was to identify the salamander letter that was a forgery from top to bottom. Hofmann had penned the entire thing. So they had an easier time identifying things that he changed instead of things that he invented out of whole cloth. It's amazing. What's even crazier about this is, blows my mind. His forgeries still surface today and pass muster. Recently, there was a penny that was made by Mark Hofmann that sold for $48,000 at a Beverly Hills auction as a legitimate coin. We have no way of telling how much damage Hofmann really inflicted upon the realm of honest historical study, Mormon or otherwise. And I guess that's the most frustrating part, isn't it? If Hofmann were a terrible forger, he would have been caught early on, and his work wouldn't have infected the field of study. But unfortunately for us all, he was a master, an artist, a con man, and an incredible reader of people. What's more than that, he was completely obsessive about his work. From every description I've found of him, he was completely nondescript until you questioned his work. This is a quote from Brent Ashworth, the man who was swindled out of nearly $250,000 worth of forgeries by Hofmann. Quote, "When I called him a liar or questioned one of the documents, he'd lose his temper. Nothing else seemed to make him mad." End quote. From what I've read, it seems like a lot of Hoffmann's ego was wrapped up in his ability to deceive people. From our interview just now to hearing Ashworth talk about questioning Hofmann's documents infuriating him, it just seems like Hofmann's entire existence and self-worth was dependent upon other people's amazement at something that he did or, forged or created. I think I made this point last episode, but I'm going to reiterate it. Hofmann arguably did a good thing. Now, I've been ranting for the last 5-10 minutes about how frustrating it is, how he's muddied the waters of historical study, but we can see the good that was done. And it's a horrible thing to say that a man that killed 2 people did a good thing, because they were killed in disgusting and painful ways, and he can't be forgiven for the horrible frustration and anguish that he inflicted on so many families. So many people's lives were destroyed by Hofmann's actions. But Hofmann showed the world that we can sniff out fakes and forgeries when it comes to the historical record. Now, history isn't so much of a science, but the way that we do science on history is by determining probabilities. And in the long run, that's all science really is determining probabilities. Was it probable that one man, Mark Hofmann, came up with all of these remarkable documents without something fishy going on? Doesn't seem very probable. But even before that question was asked, was it probable that the Salamander letter was worded in a way we would expect something Martin Harris wrote down to be worded? Well, it wasn't when we compare the letter to Harris's other works in a scientific manner, side by side. Was it probable that Mark Hofmann found 2 copies of the Oath of a Freeman, the most elusive and rare document in all American history? That's not very probable, so the Library of Congress didn't pay the $1.5 million for it. And I know the case can be made that the Salamander letter or the Joseph Smith III blessing or even the Anthon transcript fooled so many people that were scientifically examining them, and that's completely true, but not for very long. We're talking about a maximum of 2 years that the Salamander letter was in existence, that it was able to fool nearly everybody. But that's 2 years that it somewhat swayed the minds of some people in a field of study that's been active for over a century, studied by thousands of people. The Salamander letter didn't make an actual dent in the field of Mormon historical studies. It was a tiny blip on the historical radar until it was proven a forgery using scientific measures. The point is, we used the existing body of trustworthy scholarship in historical studies to scientifically identify a forgery. Doesn't that speak to the factual accuracy of this field more than anything else? A few episodes back, I made the point that if everything that I've studied to produce this podcast was all anti-Mormon lies, then it represents the largest conspiracy ever orchestrated in the history of humankind. A shadow society of people would have to exist, unbeknownst to everybody else in the field of historical studies, that exists for the sole purpose of manufacturing information and putting it out there as legitimate Mormon facts. We're talking a conspiracy the likes of which the world has never seen, in order to completely wash the truth out of the books and internet for 180 years and replace it with their own anti-Mormon narrative. It sounds ridiculous, right? That's because Hofmann is a perfect example of what happens when somebody actually conspires to make anti-Mormon forgeries and lies. When somebody like Hofmann starts injecting their own lies into the field of study, even if they do it in a calculated manner like Hofmann did, educated people in the field begin to stand up pretty quickly and say, something doesn't look right with this situation. We need to dive into this to find the truth. It only took 4 years of Hofmann really actively meddling with the record for people like the Tanners and others to stand up and say, we have a problem here. Maybe things aren't quite what they seem, and if there's a forger out there, we have to catch them. And now that we caught Hofmann, and we understand the scope of his forgeries, we can effectively cleanse the record of the damage done. Not entirely. We will never have every single document that Hofmann made locked away in a box somewhere and completely taken out of the record, but the majority of the damage that he has done has been washed away. It's been taken care of. We wouldn't be able to do that if not for the lifetimes of study that have been dedicated to building up this body of Mormon and historical knowledge. Up to this point, 7, possibly more books have been written about Mark Hofmann. 7 entire books have been dedicated to telling this man's story, and I only referenced 2 of them in these 3 episodes, Tracking the White Salamander and the Mormon Murders, but a huge body of scholarship has been dedicated to nothing more than exposing Hofmann's life and forgeries. Even though so much work has gone into trying to understand this anomaly of a human being, I still can't help but feel like we've been cheated. I'm not referring to Hofmann's forgeries, but rather to Hofmann himself. I've been doing a lot of reading on this guy, and watching plenty of presentations about who Hofmann was, and I hate to say it, but with most of what I've learned this far, it all seems too simplistic. I feel like Hofmann was cheated out of a fair trial, but the plea bargain got him out of the death penalty, so that's an overall positive, but it seems like he was painted as nothing short of a monster. If you read a lot of the news articles I've been reading on this guy, you'll see what I'm talking about. They sold the story of a heartless villain that set out on a mission to smear the church's record and spread cancerous lies to anybody he could get his ravenous clutches on. He would fly overhead searching for a helpless little rich document collector that was gullible enough to buy the Hofmann version of Mormon history, and he would swoop down at the breakneck speed of mock Hofmann and snap their pathetic spines with his own little wit and charm, bending their credulity and deep pocketbooks to his will, and creating a following of trusting zombies that wholesale bought everything he manufactured. He's the greatest adversary. A humanization of all of the evil forces that strive to collapse the church upon itself and break the goodwill of the humble followers of the one true religion. He's the dark figure in the night that hides in the deepest recesses of a believer's mind, encouraging doubts and spawning unanswerable questions that only drive members to leave and testimonies to wither. The beckoning call of his symphony of lies is far too appealing to simply ignore. Once a person begins to think like Hofmann and question the church, they're better off dead than to think ill of the church's past. So many of the newspaper articles that I've read sound just as fear-mongering and apocalyptic as everything that I just described Hofmann as. But they were capturing the public opinion of Hofmann. Most of the people that were reading the Deseret News during the 1980s, 1986 when this was going on, already had such derogatory opinions of Hofmann, and those articles were extremely effective at furthering that simplistic caricature of this bomber and forger Hofmann. But we can't ignore the good that Mark did. I feel like last episode shed a much broader light upon the real Hofmann, where so many of the articles I read lasered in on one aspect of Hofmann's work and personality, the evil aspect. I felt like walking in the room and turning the light on to really see the whole picture. Hofmann was so much more than the anti-Mormon boogeyman who heinously murdered 2 people. He was a loving father. He was an avid student of the same exact people that I'm studying from right now, whether it be the Tanners, Grant Palmer, H. Michael Marquardt, or any other Mormon historian. Hofmann loved to learn about history, Mormon or otherwise. He loved it so much that he brought it to life by making documents that fit into the history he was learning. And this is where I feel the most cheated. I want to know who the real Mark Hofmann is. And I can't help but see some serious parallels here. Hofmann loved to swindle people by making them believe he had some kind of magic knowledge of where to find old Mormon documents. He came onto the scene by claiming he had access to old documents that nobody else had access to and could dig around and find historical documents that nobody else could find. He loved it when people marveled at his work. He loved to make that interpersonal connection of fulfilling somebody's need. Many people quoted him with asking people what they were looking for, and he'd come back weeks or months later and fulfill that need for the right price. As time progressed, Hofmann gathered more people that were buying into what he was selling and believing anything he told them, and he began to live quite lavishly. He ate extremely good meals. He drove a brand new sports car. He lived in nice homes and was attempting to buy a house that would be worth well over $1 million today. He accrued more than $1.3 million in personal debt with business deals he was making. $1.3 million. Eventually, he couldn't handle the pressure, and everything came collapsing in on Hofmann. People knew about his fraud, and they were going to expose him, so he decided on the apocalyptic answer of killing 2 people and nearly killing himself. For reasons that are unclear to everybody, when Hofmann had no options left, he went with the nuclear option, causing destruction, death, and mayhem at the expense of everybody around him. And what about that story when he was young? I mean, come on. Somehow, Hofmann got a hold of a metal detector and told his friends he knew where he could find buried treasure. They go out poking around in the field, and lo and behold, right where Hofmann had buried the jar of coins before, they found the exact treasure they were looking for. Are you serious? I'm going to read something from a court document that came to us in 1873. In the realm of historical terms, this is a very reliable document that was reprinted 3 separate times when it surfaced, each reprinting being copied from the original document. There's an entire pedigree attached to this document, but suffice it to say we can rely on the information as being fairly historically accurate. The pages recounting this court proceeding were torn from the docket book of Justice Albert Neely, who was the presiding judge over Joseph Smith's 1826 trial. Check the show notes for a link to the UTLM's entire story behind this document. This is quoting Josiah Stowell, who is Joseph Smith's good friend and fellow treasure hunter, on the stand. Quote, Josiah Stowell sworn, says that prisoner had been at his house something like 5 months, had been employed by him to work on farm part of time, that he pretended, the word pretended there means claimed, to have skill of telling where hidden treasures in the earth were by means of looking through a certain stone. That prisoner had looked for him sometimes, once to tell him about money buried in Bend Mountain in Pennsylvania, once for gold on Monument Hill, and once for a salt spring, and that he positively knew that the prisoner could tell and did possess the art of seeing those valuable treasures through the medium of said stone. Basically, Joseph Smith was able to see buried treasure with a metal detector, a rock in his hat. That prisoner had told by means of this stone where a Mr. Bacon had buried money, that he and prisoner, meaning Stowell, had been in search of it, that prisoner had said it was in a certain root of a stump 5 feet from the surface of the earth, and with it would be found a tail feather. That said Stowell and prisoner thereupon commenced digging, found a tail feather, but money was gone. That he supposed the money moved down. That he had been in company with prisoner digging for gold and had the most implicit faith in prisoner's skills. End quote. Joseph Smith buried a tail feather in the ground and said, I know where to find treasure. And they went and dug for the treasure, and they found the tail feather that Joseph Smith had buried earlier. Let's just see how long this analogy holds. Joseph Smith was a very curious and intelligent young man. He began reading books about nearly anything he could get his hands on, whether they were religious pamphlets circulating during the Second Great Awakening, or it was his dad's Bible, or whatever could be picked up from the bargain bin at the E.B. Grandin print store, or brought home with him from his couple of years of school that he attended. Joseph practiced treasure digging, spending hours looking into a rock in his hat, telling people around him what special knowledge he had that nobody else could have, where to find things that people were looking for. Smith was the foremost authority on seeing things, mostly buried things, but occasionally other things as well, like where somebody's horse was after he had stolen the horse. Joseph enjoyed the feeling that he got when he would tell somebody something and they would completely believe him. He would tell them he knew where to find some lost treasure they were looking for, possibly a horse the person had recently lost, or, a feather that was buried in the ground. Joseph would lie to the people around him and make business deals he couldn't keep. By the time 1837 had rolled around, Joseph Smith had accrued 1.3 million of today's dollars in debt. 1.3 million. With bad business practices and poor management of money. Some people around him knew that he was a fraud, but Joseph still kept persisting and digging himself even deeper. By 1844, Joseph had so many enemies and so much debt from multiple sources. Worse than that, a guy named William Law was about to publish a newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, that would expose Joseph's polygamy and fraud to the world. People were about to find out how much of a con man Joseph was, so he chose the apocalyptic answer and blew up the printing press that published the newspaper. Over the days following Joseph's rash action of tyranny and suppression of information, he went with the nuclear option and turned himself in, thinking it was the end for him. Before Joseph died in the Carthage shootout, he killed 2 people, and then fell out of a window and was unwillingly shot multiple times at point-blank range, never standing on trial for his actions. Now, while Joseph and Mark's stories aren't mirrored images, there are some prominent similarities we just can't ignore. And I suppose that's what this whole trilogy of episodes has been centered around, and probably why I can't seem to get enough of Hofmann. I've said many times that I absolutely love Joseph Smith for reasons that I can't fully comprehend. I just love a compelling individual, and Joseph was definitely that, among other things. And I guess the reasons I've been researching Joseph Smith so much are the same reasons why I've spent so much time researching Mark Hofmann. I started reading about Joseph Smith because I was tired of the cardboard cutout that I had known my whole life. Joseph Smith was the prophet, holy and pious, nearly infallible all his holy days. The ground he walked on practically glowed with the reverence that Joseph radiated from his visage. That version of Joseph Smith bored me and is about as compelling as a stone rolling down a hill. I only knew Joseph with these simple words, prophet, seer, revelator, and I missed out on the dynamic part of Joseph that makes him a compelling personality. Well, I guess that's where the analogy between Joseph and Mark is strongest. I only knew Mark Hofmann by the words murderer, forger, bomber, killer, adversary, liar. And I missed out on the dynamic part of Hofmann that makes him a real person with a compelling story. I don't think there's really any way to comprehend Hofmann. He's just too complicated. There's so many moving pieces that make up his personality, and trying to describe him with simple words just isn't enough. That's the parallel between Joseph and Mark that I find holds me in rapture and has effectively devoured every waking moment of the past 3 weeks. One could spend a lifetime researching either of these men and never truly understand who they are. To put some perspective on it, so we can see just how prolific Hofmann was in his forgeries, I'm going to list off just a rap sheet of the Mormon-only ones. We have the Solomon Spaulding Sidney Rigdon land deed, the 1825 money digging agreement, letter of Joseph Smith to Josiah Stowell, Anthon transcript, letter of Peter and David Whitmer to Bithell Todd, Oliver Cowdery holograph manuscripts of original Book of Mormon, letter of Lucy Mack Smith to Mary Pierce, Joseph Smith's signatures in the first edition Book of Mormon, E.B. Grandin contact, letter of Martin Harris to William Wines Phelps, that's the Salamander letter, letter of Joseph Smith to Emma Smith hymnal, Isaac Gallen promissory notes, letter revelation of Joseph Smith to Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith the third blessing, letter of Joseph Smith to Maria and Sarah Lawrence, Joseph Smith to Jonathan Dunham, William Clayton Emigrant Guide, handwritten white notes, Spanish fork notes, Deseret currency, letter of Thomas Bullock to Brigham Young, Martin Harris to Walter Conrad, letter of David Whitmer to Walter Conrad, second anointing blessing, the Nathan Harris Book of Common Prayer with the Martin Harris poem in it. And then these are some non-Mormon forgeries he did. The Oath of a Freeman, the Second Oath of a Freeman, the letter of Daniel Boone, the Betsy Ross letter, the Jim Brimger promissory notes, the Call of the Wild book plate and Jack London's signature, and of course there's the rumored document of the Oliver Cowdery history. I mean, these are just some of the forgeries that we know of. There are so many more that we don't even know, that we haven't even unearthed yet as being Hofmann's. And I suppose that's possibly one more parallel between Joseph Smith and Mark Hofmann. Joseph came up with a plethora of revelations that were his own revelations, his own words. Mark Hofmann came up with a plethora of forgeries that were his own forgeries, his own words. And, you know, among their many parallels that are striking to say the least, I find one major difference here. Joseph Smith was exposed and caught in a day when printing materials were the cheapest they had been in history up to that point. Anybody could go to the local print shop and pay them to print off a pamphlet that said whatever that person wanted. Information was traveling at the speed of a horse everywhere throughout settled America, and most people knew about this crazy cult of Mormonites that were cropping up. Joseph went with the nuclear option of blowing up the printing press only once he realized he would be exposed to the world, and there was no walking back the damage that had been done. Bible scholars, preachers, historians, and other intellectuals were suspecting Joseph as a conman and a fraud, and he didn't want to be exposed. Well, similarly, when Hofmann was about to be exposed, he went with his version of the nuclear option. But before deciding to kill two people, scholars, bishops, historians, forensic experts, and other people in relevant fields were beginning to suspect that Hofmann was a conman, and he didn't want to be exposed. These points may sound exactly the same, but the difference I find is the availability of knowledge in 1836 as opposed to 1986. If not for the thousands of hours dedicated to studying Hofmann's work, we may never have found out that he was a conman, especially if he would have been slightly more cautious about his business practices. It took an age of lightning-fast communication and wide availability of books to historians and scholars to even begin to question Hofmann's work, and once those questions were asked, it was only a matter of time before he was caught. And I suppose that's the greatest part of the information age that we're experiencing right now. Con men have to work much harder than Joseph did in his time to not be discovered, and in the end, they usually slip up and get caught anyway. I would contend, however, that had Hofmann lived in the 1830s, we might be singing praise to that man who communes with Jehovah. He may have started up his own religion with his ability to quote-unquote find original gospel manuscripts or something. He may have found an artifact that was once Jesus's thing or whatever and started his own cult that worships Hofmann in addition to Jesus instead of Joseph Smith in addition to Jesus. But he couldn't do it in the 1980s, and he sure couldn't do it today. Hofmann operated at the very edge of when the internet was starting. Imagine the level of communication between people that were being defrauded by him today. If another Hofmann cropped up today, how quickly do you think he would be caught with scholars and historians in constant contact with each other? Arguably, the whole reason Hofmann chose to kill Christensen was because he was about to meet with Kenneth Rendell, a document examiner, and this meeting would expose Hofmann to both of them as a fraud. Imagine how fast Hofmann would have been caught if those men were taking photos of the papyri on their phones and emailing them back and forth to each other to see what they thought about it, as would be the case today. And I suppose that might be the overall point to all of this. The only way to catch a con man is with more information and wider education. Con men come in all shapes, sizes, ethnicities, and places. They might be in the form of a guy selling you a knife set, but of course the real deal is in selling the knives for yourselves. A con man might be buying cheap watch parts from China and manufacturing Rolexes to sell off of the street. That con man might say, "Hey, check this out. I found this buried treasure that we've been looking for." Treasure that may have been buried in the ground or buried in a box of old documents. And most vindictively, a con man might come up to you and say, "I know the one and only way to get to heaven. Do you want to join my church?" The only way to catch these people and identify them as con people is to spread information by educating people. Oftentimes, the problem with con people is they're widely liked. People really liked Hofmann and couldn't picture him as a fraud. People loved Joseph Smith, arguably more so now than they did when he was alive, and they can't picture him as a fraud. I mean, this is a quote from Hugh Nibley. He's a Mormon apologist and author. He was a Mormon apologist and author about Joseph Smith's 1826 court trial. We just read from Josiah Stowell's testimony in that. Quote, "If this court record is authentic, it is the most damning evidence in existence against Joseph Smith. It would be the most devastating blow to Smith ever delivered." End quote. This next one is from Francis Kirkham, who's another Mormon apologist. Quote, if a record could be identified and it contained a confession by Joseph Smith which revealed him to be a poor, ignorant, deluded, and superstitious person, unable himself to write a book of any consequence, and whose church could not endure because it attracted only similar persons of low mentality, if such a court record confession could be identified and proved, then it follows that his believers must deny his claimed divine guidance which led them to follow him. How could he be a prophet of God, the leader of the restored church to these tens of thousands, if he had been the superstitious fraud which the pages from a book declared he confessed to be? End quote. Whether it's Hugh Nibley, Francis Kirkham, or Brent Ashworth, people don't like it when their hero is shown in true color as a fraud. Both of those quotes were written before Walters found Neely's bill to substantiate the trial in 1971. After Walters found the bill, these apologists went eerily silent. You wonder why. So how do we bring all of this together? We need to take away a proper lesson from this. And I guess the final thing I would say is just skepticize everything, all right? If you're skeptical about any given claim that a person makes, that instantly makes you less likely to be conned than the person standing next to you. It would be nice if we could all just get along and agree to not steal from each other or defraud one another, but that's not the world we live in, and human nature simply won't allow it. The only thing we can do is take prophylactic measures to guard ourselves and our loved ones against people like Hofmann and Smith. If you see a loved one that starts to buy into something that sounds too good to be true, it's your duty to skepticize the situation and ask that person, how much do you really know about this thing you're about to buy or be baptized into? How probable is it that Hofmann would actually find the exact thing that you're looking for? How probable is it that these Mormons are actually the one true church? How much do you really know about the document dealer Mark Hofmann? How much do you really know about the real Joseph Smith, not the prophet that they told you about? And it has to be said, it sounds like I'm shining a negative light on Hofmann right now as a con man. That's somewhat the case, but I'm not trying to. Like I said before, I love Joseph Smith, and I've come to love the real Joseph the more that I learn about him. I only seek to understand the man. Well, the parallels between Joseph and Mark don't stop there. I have to say, I love Mark Hofmann. The more I learn about the man, the more I'm fascinated by the real Hofmann behind all of the headlines and the stupid one-word labels. It may sound weird to hear that I love a man who is a murderer, but Joseph Smith murdered at least 2 people, and millions of people claim to love and worship him as their prophet, so maybe I'm not the weirdest one here, right? I just sincerely believe that Hofmann has been characterized as being nothing more or less than a monster, and I believe that does a disservice to him and to anybody that seeks to learn about him. So if, by some stroke of luck, this podcast makes it to the ears of Mark Hofmann, I briefly want to speak directly to him. Mark, please help us understand you. During the height of your days, you made amazing advancements into uncovering what goes on behind the closed doors of church leadership. You showed to an entire generation that the church would be willing to buy challenging historical documents just so they can squirrel them away and hide them from the harsh white light of scrutiny forever. You laid bare how ill-equipped the church is to deal with its convoluted past and foundation by a madman. No single person has done a greater service to the world of Mormon scholarship as you have, Mark. You must be commended for your effort and the amount of thought you poured into orchestrating such a massive PR nightmare for the church. Even the amount of money that you stole can be ignored when we take it on balance with the level that you expose the church. I mean, if we're talking sheer numbers here, the church makes off with $7 billion a year by conning people. You only managed $1.3 million in 6 years' time. I think we can forget about who really deserves to be in jail when we look at the numbers alone. But Mark, you also made a string of very rash and horrible decisions. And I don't think it's fair to label you as a simple murderer for a week of lapsed judgment. You're obviously much more complicated than any one-word names can describe, and apparently much more complicated than 9 hours of podcasting can represent. I know you've refused visits from anybody other than family members and your attorney, and I can't possibly begin to comprehend the reasoning behind this decision, but I hope you will begin to reconsider opening up that line of thought once again. You may think that your story has come to an end with a lifetime prison sentence, but there is a massive legacy attached to the name Mark Hofmann, and people want to know your story for real. People want to learn about the real Mark, not the Hofmann forger bomber from back in the 80s. Please, Mark, meet with some people that would be able to tell your real story. Please give an interview. This vow of silence has gone on for nearly 30 years, and it would be a tragedy to lose this story to your death that will likely happen well within the next 30 years. You're the only person that can properly tell your story. In 80 pages of notes for these episodes, I haven't actually gotten any closer to who the real Hofmann is. That's something that can only be attained through speaking with you directly, Mark. We can sit here in our internet community and try to envision who you really are, but until you actually appear on record and a real documentary can be made about you, we're all left in the dark, sifting through newspaper clippings of your legacy and trying to piece together who the real Hofmann is. What you did can't be changed. The name of Mark Hofmann will never be unshackled from the label of murderer. But what you can do is offer everybody else the chance to understand you and your mission. You must have had an agenda to take down the church, or at very least make it look foolish. But that mission gets lost in the noise of people labeling you as extortionist and con man and murderer. I think you accomplished what you initially set out to do. But people don't look at your exposing the church and say that's the end of the story. They always end the story with bombs going off and you nearly killing yourself. There's so much information that only you have that would be so useful to the world. Did you manufacture the Oliver Cowdery history and leak to the press that it exists? What actually happened with the McClellan collection, and why was it found in the church archives while you were going to trial? What was your actual plan with the McClellan collection? How much money did the church really give you, and for how many documents? We know about the Salamander letter and the Joseph Smith III blessing and the Charles Anthon manuscript, but what else did you sell the church that didn't get any press that was just as challenging to their history that they successfully suppressed? What else is the church hiding? Did the church really have nothing to do with your plea bargain, or was there motivation for them not to go to court over this whole ordeal and they forced the plea deal? These are all questions that I want to ask you directly, Mark. And the best part is, you can answer them however you want. And it's up to the church and the Mormon historical community to deal with your answers, truthful or not. There could be a new resurgence of Hofmann altering Mormon history, because anything you said in an interview would have to be answered by the church. If you gave us proof that the Oliver Cowdery history existed, even if it was your work, your forgery, the church would stumble all over themselves with first denying it, then stumbling around, then trying to accept it, and then putting out a PR-friendly press release that, you know, that the history really does exist and that they bought it from you for this amount of money. It would just be a nightmare all over again. There could be a whole new era of Hofmann forgeries coming out of the church vaults, making the church and its leadership look foolish all over again in the internet age. We need this. Mark, if your initial vision was to show the world that the church will go to extreme lengths to hide their history, you've already won. And now I'm offering a chance to do it all over again. Please reconsider doing an interview with somebody, and please allow your thoughts to meander to the possibility of interviewing for a documentary. We can't lose your story just because you're locked away in a cage for the rest of your life. Please give us a legacy we can love instead of just being that guy that made the salamander letter that blew some people up. We deserve the truth. And more importantly, Mark, you deserve a proper legacy. Do it for your family. But most importantly, do it for you. Help us answer that all-important question with which we opened up this episode. Why? Until that day comes that Mark Hofmann opens himself up to the world for a real interview, and that day may never come. I suppose this is the best we can get. And my only final thought is, thank you, Mark. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for listening to the entire deconstruction of Mark Hofmann. Obviously, with as much information I included here, I was digging in pretty deep into a lot of sources. All of those sources you can find linked on the show notes for the show. And, you know, I wasn't lying when I said I have 80 pages of notes here. That's over 41,000 words. This was a lot of work to put these 3 episodes together. And they're up there for free. But what I am going to do is I'm going to offer the PDF on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you'll be able to find a PDF copy of the show notes for this episode. And in that PDF copy, it's just the exact 80 pages that I read from in order to make these 3 episodes, with all of the sources intact. My primary source that I used for the timeline was from the BYU library. That source is linked in the show notes for this episode. And there's just an insane amount of work went into this. And I hope that everybody can appreciate the amount of time that this has taken in order to compile and produce. And the PDF is available on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You can go there and download it. It's only available for people that subscribe or people that contribute to the show. The episode, to listen to the episode, is completely free, but getting a hold of a PDF of it, that is going to cost, $1 an episode, $4 a month. That's not too bad. If you'd like to do that, or you can go on to nakedmormonismpodcast.com and make a one-time donation there of $4 or more, and send me your email, and I will be more than happy to send you a PDF copy of this over email. That being said, this is the end of this huge episode. I've had an insane amount of fun learning about Mark Hofmann, and I have to tell you, out of all of this, I just scratched the surface. I barely got into this guy. There's just an absolutely insane amount of work that's been done about Mark Hofmann. And please don't think that I'm joshing or I'm pulling anybody's leg when I say, please allow us to do an interview. No, I'm dead serious. I would love to interview Mark Hofmann and do it for a documentary. I think that needs to be done. Whether it's me, whether it's any documentary maker, it doesn't matter. Mark Hofmann's story needs to be told again. And in the day of the internet age, people would eat it up. But we'll have to see how things develop over the coming weeks. And that's it for this episode. God. But before closing it up tonight, I'm finally calling it good. I need to thank a few people. First off, I will thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. Thank you so much for posting up on there. It's fantastic. We hit over 1,000 likes. Oh, I'm so excited about that. I also want to thank Jason Camo for providing the music in this show that's used with his permission. For more of his music, go to aloststateofmind.com. I want to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in this show with his permission, as well as on the daughter podcast, the Glassbox Podcast. From his blog, you can go to weirdmormonshit.com. I'd like to thank all of the patrons who support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You are awesome. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email nakedmormonism@gmail.com, or you can call and leave a voicemail at 864-625-3366 or 864-NAKED-MO. But most of all, I would like to thank all of you amazing, wonderful listeners. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. I'll give you a second to guess just how much was actually Hofmann's words. Go ahead, take a guess. Percentage-wise, 50%, 75, 25, whatever. All right, you got a number in your head? Well, you're wrong. All of it. The answer is every single line was constructed from Hofmann's own words.